You step outside the hush of your room and let the sky do the talking. It speaks in slow brightness spilled from old fire, a spillway of stars that seems to point somewhere steady even though everything up there is walking in circles very politely. Tonight you are following north, and you let that idea be a pillow first and a direction only later. You tilt your head until the breath moves easier. The Milky Way looks like a river that forgot it was water and became a road. The air tastes a little like stone cooling after a warm day. And you, sleep-weighted but curious, begin to feel why travelers once trusted the ceiling more than any map. North Star, you murmur, and the sky smiles at your confidence. Here's a quiet truth to keep in your pocket. The particular star that plays north changes over long ages because the Earth nods a slow yes with its axis. Polaris is the present actor, not the only one ever cast. But the role itself, a certainty in the dark, is old, and your body understands the role even if names come and go. You navigate by relationships, the little pot pointing, the kite of Cygnus pouring feathers along the river of light, the lion crouched lower than you remembered. You hum a line so your feet learn it. You're not rushing. Nobody who follows stars rushes. You imagine the first soft steps north out of Africa as a kind of sky reading performed with 100 other clues. Shorelines stitched into memory, river courses rehearsed as lullabies, the easy logic of dawn rising over water if you keep a certain bank to your left. Mainstream fact to keep your bearings. Our species' deep roots are African. Fossils and tools say so, and genes say so more quietly. Modern humans appear in Africa well before 200,000 years ago, and later, in several windows, small bands expand outward. Which window? That's where the debates take off their shoes and try to be polite. Some paths explore the Levant early, others, much later, become the broad migrations many of us learned in school. For tonight, you don't need a date. You need the feeling of a sky that can be trusted to repeat itself. You walk in the second person because that's how the night wants to be told. You pass acacia silhouettes with their flat-top patience. You let the smell of dust cool into something like bread that forgot to rise. The wind goes slack and your hearing grows extra rooms. You notice the small teeth of insects talking near your ankles, the sly water sounds of a river you can't yet see. Above, a lazy arc of birds writes a note on the margin of the sky. Migrators, seasonal editors, reminding you that bodies remember routes even when maps have not been invented yet. If you were lost, and you are not, you could borrow their sentence. The trick that makes night gentle is the trick that made migration possible, simplifying the world into dependable cues. Keep the sea murmur in one ear and the smell of inland plants in the other. Keep the bright band of the galaxy angled just so against your shoulder. Pace yourself by how long a song lasts before the Pleiades slip behind your thumb. Quirky tidbit for your blanket. Some coastal foragers time their shellfish harvests to the moon's big breaths, not by a calendar they can hold, but by the shape of shadows in the intertidal and the velvet hiss of water pulling pebbles back. If you listen long enough, even stones announce the tide. Historians still argue whether those first steps out of Africa favored coasts like a string of lanterns or inland corridors like the Nile and the Levantine hills, and whether the earliest excursions were bold migrations or seasonal wanderings that only look like arrows when you draw them on paper. They argue as kindly as possible about big questions, one large wave or many smaller ones, steady trickle or sudden sprints, how much the green Sahara, yes, sometimes greener than you picture, opened and shut like a door with climate's hand on the knob. You don't have to referee. You get to imagine the consistent part. People balancing curiosity and caution under a reproducible sky. Your shoulders loosen as you picture a shoreline walk at night. Wet sand under heels. The occasional lace of phosphorescence when your step convinces plankton to become stars that forgot to look up. Someone carries a coal nested in punky wood. Someone else knows which creek bends taste less like stone and more like patience. You pause at a tidal pool and let your fingers learn its temperature. You point a child's hand at the slow spinning dipper and say, "That's where we keep our directions." The child nods with the solemnity of all children entrusted with a secret that isn't really a secret. There's a practical quiet to your steps. You count time by the rise of Orion's belt over a certain hill, by how long it takes the Southern Cross to rotate like a careful hinge. Even though North will someday trade stars and names, the rotation remains a metronome you can feel. You make jokes about your feet filing a complaint with management, and the manager promising to forward the complaint to the Department of Softer Moss. You sip from a skin that tastes faintly of smoke, a flavor your tongue now translates as safety rather than kitchen. Jokes are a form of navigation. They keep the pace human. A second mainstream truth leans in politely, even if, North Star, as a fixed brand shuffles, the night sky is a map of relationships strong enough to steer by when combined with wind habits, bird paths, and the geometry of shore and river. Mariners long after your earliest walkers will formalize it with instruments and math. Your band formalizes it with repetition. Your heels memorize which dunes slants mean. This way, your skin learns how far inland the night air smells of salt, and your ears pick out frog dialects the way a merchant distinguishes coins by weight. It's not mysticism, it's folding weather into habit. You practice the oldest safety, group tempo. Too fast and blisters edit the next day. Too slow and the wells between camps move farther than they should. There's a soft choreography at night. Taller walkers at the edges casting wind shadows for smaller ones. A lamp carried high enough to be useful and low enough not to blind. A hummed line that lets stragglers accelerate without panic. Someone always watches the horizon for the faint iron gray where dawn begins, not because you're desperate for light but because night travel is a promise you keep briefly and then hand back to morning. Historians still argue whether star lore itself was an early driver of routes or a pleasant redundancy layered on shorelines, rains, and grazing corridors. Did people say, "We go north because the sky tells us," or "We go north because the river says yes, and the sky agrees in case the river goes quiet"? The answer may be a shrug and a soup. Use both, use all, and borrow the sky's patience when the ground sulks. That's the bedtime version and likely the real one too. What you carry forward from this sleepy introduction is simply a feeling. The ceiling is not empty. It is repeatable. You can close your eyes and still see the smear of the galaxy where your thumb last measured it. You can put your cheek to the wind and still smell left from right. You can let water and stars take turns being railings and never have to argue with them. If your own day felt like a lost path, the original travelers lend you their trick. Reduce panic to cues. Reduce cues to a gentle algorithm. Follow sound. Follow smell. Check the sky. Check the water. Keep the group in conversation length. You end your first watch the way any sensible traveler would. By sitting down where the ground decides to be kind. By letting your breath and the Milky Way match tempos. And by promising your knees that tomorrow will be more of the same measured progress. A final small joke. If a star falls, do we owe the path a tip, and the room in your head dims to that good gray just before sleep? North still exists whether you watch it or not. The night likes to be trusted. You wake to a different kind of compass, the ground itself remembering how to be generous. The air smells rinsed, as if the night carried a basin across the sky and poured it carefully over sand. Grasses lean in the smallest breeze like an audience that showed up early and got front row seats. This is the part of the story where doors that look shut most years slide open. The windows out of Africa, the brief green chapters when places you've learned to call desert ask to be pronounced savanna again. You walk north not because you're reckless but because the land, for a while, stops arguing. Your feet learn a new grammar. Wadis that spend most decades as dry sentences now flow like paragraphs. Water in clauses, hippo in footnotes. Dragonflies become punctuation. You follow a shallow string of lakes that behave like mirrors left out to cool, pale blue coins set into tan cloth. The path is unhurried, a dotted line of wet and shade and quiet fish that forgot to be shy. Joke 1. You thank the monsoon for extended hours, and it answers by rearranging your hair and insisting on a tip. Mainstream fact for your pocket as you walk: climate pulses, driven by slow wobbles in Earth's orbit and the seesaw of monsoon strength, have turned the Sahara greener many times. During humid phases, think MIS5 around 130 to 80,000 years ago, and later the African humid period roughly 14,800 to 5,500 years ago, the desert hosted lakes, rivers, and grasslands. Shorelines still line the land like faint penciled circles, fossil diatoms, lake muds, and old beaches tell you a lake once napped here. When the green lights up, corridors open, the Nile swells into a traveling companion. The Sahara grows passable by strings of water and pasture. The Red Sea coast wears a lace of mangrove and shell. You move with a river because rivers move with you. The Nile is a long promise read slowly, and its banks turn the maps inside your legs into route cards. You don't stride in a straight arrow. You meander the way water meanders, taking hints from oxbow shadows and the silt's particular perfume. Levity arrives with the birds. Storks ratify your direction with their own northbound meeting minutes in the sky. Ibises gossip in the reeds like relatives who remember too many birthdays at once. Down in the mud, your toes catalog coolness like librarians. Historians still argue whether the most consequential early exits favored the Nile, Sinai, Levant corridor, or the coastal arc along the Red Sea and into Arabia. They also argue how the greener Sahara participated, as a highway in wetter times or as a patchwork of rest stops, drink, forage, wait, move, stitched together by patience rather than speed. One more friendly wrinkle: did the earliest excursions, think Skull and Kafsa in the Levant around 120 to 90,000 years ago, or the even earlier Mislia Jaw, seed lineages that lasted, or were they false starts overtaken by later waves? The night nods. Your job is simpler. Follow water, follow food, follow repeatable. You pass a low bluff painted with animal memory, cattle with a glossy confidence in their shoulders, swimmers with long hands, boats sketched where all you see now is wind. These aren't your drawings tonight. They are the Sahara's way of setting reminders across calendars. Rock art and lake beds sing the same chorus. For a while we were damp, and people came. You add a quiet harmony with your steps and keep going. Quirky tidbit to fold into your scarf. In parts of Africa and Arabia, Researchers read climate histories in fossil hyrax urine, a shiny, tar-like crust called middens. The little creatures obligingly varnished their living rooms with decades of minerals and pollen. Later, humans with tiny drills listened to those layers like a record, humid, arid, humid, each band a season's breath turned into chemistry. It's a strange library and an excellent one, and it tells you why a valley that looks stern today sometimes softened long enough to be a bridged out on green mornings. The pace of your band becomes intentionally boring, the good kind of boring that turns distance into domestic habit. You start before the flies practice their craft. You break where acacia gives shade and the bank's clay keeps it cool. You stop when the frog's chorus becomes supper rather than signal. The sky does its part. Dawn arrives with a small metal taste. Noon goes white as a blank page, and evening folds the heat away like a well-trained blanket. You measure the day by how often the littlest ankles ask for river splash rights. Mainstream truth number 2 leans on the path sign. When conditions permitted, humans followed corridors north not as armies but as households. Small bands carrying one another's stories, tool traditions, and quiet skills. Evidence for this shows up as familiar lithic styles stepping north and east, as shell middens hugging coasts, as bones of water-loving creatures where maps now print the word desert. In Arabia, a toolkit known as the Nubian complex pops up in places that make geographers grin, a technological accent that may trace people or ideas across a temporarily generous peninsula. Historians still argue whether that Nubian accent proves direct movement from the Nile corridor into Arabia, or whether convergence, different groups finding similar answers to similar stone problems, mimics a marching line. They also debate how low the Red Sea fell during certain cold snaps and whether Bab el-Mandeb, narrow even on grumpy days, offered walkable shallows, raft hops, or just the persuasive geography of islands as stepping stones. Nobody can hand you a ferry ticket with a date on it. You walk because the world is temporarily willing. The green window teaches logistics disguised as scenery. You learn which lake margins keep their edges underfoot, and which flirt with your ankles. You learn that papyrus is kind to hands but nasty to wrists if you ignore its moods. You learn to read wind rakes on water to choose a crossing before the sun gets ideas. You memorize where catfish line up like sleepy punctuation under an undercut bank, and you pretend you never told anyone in case your reputation as a magician is useful later. Joke 2 comes when the first cloud wall of the afternoon builds its formal hat and climbs the horizon like a dignitary mounting stairs. You bow to it and say, "We humbly request the earlier, gentler rain package." It answers with a few extremely firm drops and then, perhaps flattered, decides to be reasonable. The smell, petrichor combed with green, becomes a geography all on its own. Sometimes the window narrows and asks for patience instead of distance. The Sahara remembers its day job. The Nile sulks lower. A chain of ponds forgets to connect. Your band becomes weather farmers, tending to time instead of fields. You camp longer, trade news with neighbors who also found the edge of green, add cordage to your stores, and stop pretending to be annoyed at rest. The children practice net mending on old vine. The elders point out constellations with revised names because the sky writes new jokes every decade, and your hands teach themselves which grasses make the quietest sleeping mats. Forward isn't just distance, it's readiness for the next door the world opens. Historians still argue whether the greenest pulses sync neatly with the big dispersals. Or if people used mixed strategies, hug the coast, leap up a river, cut and land on a streak of wet years, then regroup when the door swings shut. They disagree politely about timing, whether your favorite corridor thrummed more around 70 to 50,000 years ago, or whether earlier pulses carried quieter, earlier guests. The genes in your pocket, lineages called L3M and N, will get their own bedtime story later, and they will complicate this nicely. For now, you learn the gentle arithmetic of windows. Opportunity times preparation equals not having to hurry. You keep a coal sleeping in its bark cradle because even green seasons have rude mornings. You fill skins when you can because rivers improvise more than they should. You carry sea scents in your nose from long days when the shore is your second compass, and silt scents in your knuckles from days when the Nile feels like a cousin willing to introduce you to the Levant. Quirky tidbit number 2 before you douse the lamp in your head, from above, with tools your era didn't have, the old lakes leave shoreline loops visible in satellite images, perfect ovals and scalloped crescents penciled onto the desert. From the ground, you sometimes feel those ovals without seeing them. A ring of hardpan under a few inches of sand, a tide of tiny snail shells under heel, a low arc of pebbles that shouldn't be so neat. You step onto one by accident, and your ankle says someone watered this place for centuries, and the thought makes your shoulders drop a notch. Evening settles back in. The frogs in a receding pool recite a careful benediction. The wind changes to its night voice, and the grasses agree to stop telling the day's secrets. You look up to your old ceiling, the dipper tilted like a polite ladle, the river of the Milky Way poured thin, and you smile because you recognize the trick now. Doors open when you can read them. The green windows don't shout. They whisper welcome in mud and pollen and a particular kind of sky. You tuck that word into your sleeve and let sleep arrive on wet air. You reach the place where Africa exhales and Arabia inhales, a narrow throat of water that never quite makes up its mind. The shore smells briny and green at once, like a pantry that learned the word mangrove. Crabs write punctuation on wet sand and then erase it, busy editors of the tidal draft. The straight ahead, Bab el Mandeb, though you don't need its formal name to feel its tug, glints with that tin blue light water gets when the moon is in charge of the schedule. You are not here to be dramatic. You are here to time the crossing so it feels like an unhurried step across a puddle the world forgot to mop. You start by shrinking the problem. Tide tells you when the sea practices humility. Moon tells tide when to show up for work. You watch the little forests of mangrove nematophores breathe, roots stabbing upward like 100 shy fingers. And you learn their knees' language. When half the roots show, the flats are generous. When only their knuckles peek, go mend nets and whistle at fish instead. Someone in your band sprinkles shells in a fan at the waterline. You measure how long the sea takes to claim them, a pretend stopwatch the moon can't resist. Joke 1. You thank the moon for overtime and it raises an eyebrow you can't see, because that's the moon's management style. Mainstream fact to lay beside your read bundle. When ice grew fat on high latitudes, sea level fell over 100 meters at glacial peaks, making this strait narrower and its islands larger. Even during warmer pulses, many windows left distances small enough to tempt a crossing with bundled reeds, drift logs, or skin float aids, especially if you picked times when currents sulked and wind forgot to be interesting. On Africa's Red Sea side, places like Abdur, Eritrean coast, preserve ancient shorelines and shell use during the last interglacial. On the far side, Much later but comforting, a modern human finger bone from Al-Wasta in Saudi Arabia shows our people deep inside Arabia by roughly 80-something thousand years ago. You're not trying to stamp passports. You're reading the tide. You make camp on the kind of shore that knows a secret. Limpets and oysters advertise the proof that coastlines are storage rooms for patient travelers. Fires keep small manners, smoky enough to invite mosquitoes to a different party, low enough to avoid telling the wind you're available for conversation. Children practice the shell tap code: 1 tap for slack water, 2 for clean pull, 3 4. Put your sandals back on, we're not heroes today. You gather palm midribs and reed sheaves, testing each bundle with a foot's truthfulness. Anything that argues underfoot is demoted to firewood. Historians still argue whether the earliest people crossing here sailed on proper rafts, pulled across tidal shallows with help from sandbars and islands, or simply rode flood and ebb with skin bladders for lift and nerve for the rest. They also argue which window mattered most, an early last interglacial flirtation or later cooler episodes where sea level was friendlier but wind more opinionated. And they haven't finished debating whether crossings were rare heroics or ordinary chores repeated by small bands who treated the strait like a fussy ford. Your shoulders choose the last option because your shoulders like repeatable chores. The strait itself offers stepping stones, a volcanic lump in the middle with steep black shoulders, lesser islets like dropped punctuation, bars that appear and vanish exactly when your patience proposes intermission. You do not go alone. 2 bundles lashed side by side carry the elders and the cooking stone. Swimmers flank, towing by cord loop across the chest, a tug that reminds you to breathe like a sensible mammal. The ember from camp rides in a clamshell hungry for quiet. A child puts a wet finger into the wind and performs the oldest science. Is this a yes? And the wind, for once, nods. Quirky tidbit for your pocket. You smear a little fish oil along the inside of the reed lashings. It persuades water to slide and your knots to shrug less when the reeds swell. Someone else ties tiny pebbles into a fringe under the bundle's nose. They click faintly and let you hear drift when your eyes are busy watching a wave's opinion. There is no romance in any of this. There is only friction management, which is the coast's real magic. Night doesn't mean blindness here. It means phosphorescence, the plankton's shy handwriting lighting up under each stroke. You choose neap tide to mute the moon's bossiness, or slack at change of flow, when the sea thinks about switching lanes and forgets to shove. The stars help, but mostly as company. Their job is to keep your mind wide and your breath measured. You count 7 songs to the islet, 3 to the bar, and 4 more to the shallows where mangrove roots applaud your decision. Joke 2. Halfway across, a fish jumps, sprays your ear, and you announce that something with scales has baptized the expedition. Nobody laughs because nobody wants to swallow just now, but they'll laugh later with vigor. Mainstream facts quieter twin. Along Red Sea shores and into southern Arabia, shell middens, coastal toolkits, and mangrove-friendly camps tell the same story again and again. People gleaned, fished, and walked the seams between land and water for a very long time. When sea level dropped, coastal shelves now drowned would have been long glassy terraces of beach and lagoon. Many of the best campsites are underwater today, which is unfair but on brand for geology. Historians still argue whether the coastal highway was primary or backup. Did most people follow this salted breadcrumb trail, or were inland monsoon lakes and river corridors the true heavy lifters with the coast as holiday road? They spar kindly over Jebel Faya stone traditions and how to read Nubian complex tool signatures, diffusion or movement, convergence or kin. Your raft doesn't care about the footnotes. It cares about rhythm. Push, float, breathe, joke, repeat. You land not like conquerors but like people arriving at a friend's kitchen door, soft-footed, grateful, aware the floor might be damp. The islet smells of salt crust and old lava. You unload the elder and the stone and the quiet bundle of fire. Flame takes politely, a small warm answer to the night's larger questions. Everybody stares at their hands for a minute, because hands that have just stopped swimming behave like recent graduates, a little confused, a little proud, ready to pretend this was always easy. On the Arabian side, the beach is the same but tilted, shells you recognize, but with a new accent. Mangroves that nod in a slightly different meter. You're still under the same sky, but even a star's shoulder angle feels altered when land argues in a new dialect. The inland hills wear a color you haven't named yet. You do what travelers always do, apply household habits to a new room. Water, fire, food, sleep. Then news, a day's walk inward. Someone finds a freshwater seep under a lime crust, and the seep answers yes to your cup. The route unwinds a little further simply because the world refrains from saying no. Quirky tidbit number 2. While you wait out an unfriendly wind on a sand spit, you pass time cracking whelks with a hammerstone you keep specifically for shell dinners. The stone grows a polish in one crescent where it met 1,000 shells, an archaeologist's favorite kind of evidence of boredom well managed. Later, someone will pick it up and name it. You swear, with a satisfied nod. You call it lunch. Here's a soft reassurance to carry into sleep. Crossings like this rarely happen once. They happen season after season, family after family, in both directions and with a laziness myths don't respect. The sea closes some days and opens others. The door gets used when it's useful, ignored when inland green windows offer sweeter rooms. In your band's story, the strait becomes a threshold with moods, not a line in a book. Joke 3 waits for camp. You hold up a reed that refused to help, snap it neatly, and promote it to Director of Kindling. It performs admirably in its new role, which is more than you can say for some directors. As you lie back, the shore sighs its slow sleep breath and the stars go back to being chandeliers instead of instruments. The ember on the islet side will go out without complaint. The ember on your side will learn the local gossip and keep it to itself. The tide creeps back to erase your footprints, doing what tides always do, renew the stage for the next set of small actors carrying bundles and singing short songs. You close your eyes on a thought that is both humble and large. North is not a line. It's a series of polite invitations, water then sand then water again, that you accept only when you have the time and the tide. On another night the road simply leans left, and you lean with it, away from mangrove breath, toward a tongue of stone the sea keeps licking, Sinai. The gravel underfoot changes its grammar, larger words, fewer opinions, and the air sheds its salt to smell faintly of quartz dust and sunbaked thyme. Stars don't move, but your confidence does. You pick up the old trick of pacing by Orion's belt and the ladle tilt of the dipper while the ground arranges your steps into a slower, steadier paragraph. The peninsula is a careful teacher. It makes you walk by wadis, those dry rivers that remember water as if it were a relative who writes reliable letters, and it rewards you with night-cooled stones that keep your ankles honest. Here the map is made of fan aprons, acacia shadows, and wind-poured dunes that sleep like cats across the trail. You practice the desert's favorite ritual, leaving early enough that noon can't find you, and learn the microclimates of shade, rock noses that throw a patch just wide enough for a doze, canyon bends that store a thimble of cool, the silky understory of a tamarisk acting like a voluntary umbrella. Joke 1. You file an official complaint with the Department of Softer Sand. The department replies in writing by depositing a dune directly into your shoes. You angle north and west until the sky begins telling Mediterranean jokes. A wetter smell, a faint resin from pine and pistachio, a breeze that thinks it learned manners in another country. The limestone hills ahead are Mount Carmel's shoulders, and the hills where caves the way a porch wears chairs, skull, tabun. Meslia tucked into the cliff like small rooms with big patience. You do what bands have always done when a cliff offers a veranda with a view. You sit where the drip line can't reach and watch the light change until the day starts to taste like rest. Mainstream fact to set gently on the cave shelf. In these hills, modern human bones, faces and jaws that could pass in any train station, appear early. At Skull and Kafsa, fossils dated to roughly 120,000 to 90,000 years ago carry our anatomy, alongside hints of meaning, burials, lumps of ochre, and seashells, including Mediterranean glycymeris, carried inland, sometimes pierced as if they had jobs beyond soup. And at Meslia Cave, a partial upper jaw with teeth belonging to our species pushes the presence of modern humans in the Levant back perhaps to around 177,000, 194,000 years ago. Surprisingly old, like a postcard that arrived decades ahead of schedule. The caves do not shout, they nod. The floor under your seat crunches with flakes of flint, conversations half finished by people who solved edges for a living. Your hand knows the pleasure of a good conchoidal fracture. The first ping feels like glass learning to be helpful. You can almost reconstruct their evening. A warming cup, a pile of nodules, the soft percussion of antler on stone, someone humming a count so the rhythm breathes usable blades. A child tries to echo the sound with a pebble xylophone, 3 clinks that nearly rhyme, and the cave approves with a drip that arrives on the beat. Historians still argue whether these early arrivals represent successful, lasting expansions of modern humans beyond Africa or early forays, waves that receded when climate turned lanes off and Neanderthals reclaimed favored rooms. Whether the stone traditions in this region, the Levallois prepared core methods visible in both Africa and the Levant, trace people moving or ideas traveling through neighbor talk. They also debate if later industries, the Emiran and Amarian, much younger, announce another, more enduring pulse of our species into the Levant, or just an innovation wave rolling through mixed neighborhoods. The argument is polite. The caves continue to be precise. You learn why caves matter to travelers who don't intend to stay forever. They are thermostats that don't need instruction manuals. Summer heat sits down and behaves here. Winter wind forgets your name. A bench of limestone becomes your camp ledger. Who slept? Who sang? Who promised to fix a sandal and actually did? On a high shelf someone tucked a shell the size of a thumbnail. On a lower one, a red streak of ochre kisses the wall like a small flag of attention. You had nothing but breath and a promise to sweep before leaving. Quirky tidbit for your pocket. The cliffs wear a thin chocolate glaze called desert varnish, a slow microbial collaboration of manganese and clay that paints rock faces over centuries. If you draw a finger across it, which you politely do not, it comes away brown and smug. If you watch long enough, the varnish wrinked letters by bacteria would write the patience of aridity as legibly as any inscription. The same varnish can hold ancient handprints and scratches long after their authors forgot their own names. You set your pace by wadis that do work, Firin, Soluf, Zalab, each a shallow script that pulls you north. When a wind arrives with a Levantine accent, you smell sage underfoot and the chemistry of rain arguing with dust. In the next fold of hills, caves trade with rock shelters where a dry drip line writes a half-moon on the floor. You stage boring miracles repeatedly. Water found, fire coaxed, tools made, skin mended, sleep earned. Joke 2. When a bat flutters out of the entrance, you bow and say, "Night shift is relieved." And the bat, being management, declines to laugh. Another mainstream truth, quiet, but warm. The Levant has long been a corridor, a weather-sensitive hallway that opens to woodlands and coasts when the climate leans wet, then yields to steppe when dryness stretches its legs. Fossils and tools show alternating presences, modern humans in one comfortable slot, Neanderthals in another, like roommates who share a lease across centuries without ever arguing over dishes. The Nile, Sinai, Levant door stays on its hinges. Who passes through depends on wind and grass. Historians still argue whether the shells at places like Kafsa, pierced and rubbed, are ornament proper, portable memory tokens, or handy weights and wads that felt useful enough to carry inland. They also argue whether the ochre found near burials is symbolic, practical, for hides and adhesives, or habit wearing red because red refuses to keep a low profile. Your fingers, stained after make-do glue experiments, vote for both. Your eyes, admiring as shells old sea shine far from shore, vote for meaning. The hills coach your navigation gently. If you lose the stars to cloud, you follow the slope logic of karst, downstream to seasonal pools, upstream to saddles that trade basins without scolding calves. You watch gazelle paths braided into the hillsides like shorthand. You learn which figs ad-lib fruit in late heat, and which wild capers make resting taste more like planning. At dusk, the Mediterranean itself offers silver on the horizon, a thin coin that says you're still walking the correct side of the table. Quirky tidbit number 2, strike flint in a quiet cave and you can smell the edge being born, a gunpowdery tang and a whetstone breath. Courtesy of ozone and silica dust, an archaeologist's nose calls a napper's perfume. And once you notice it, you can't unsmell fresh blades even in a room where the last strike happened 10,000 chapters ago. You stop at Kafsa time, a mental shorthand for a night that feels civic, as if the cave has hosted a lot of people who meant things carefully. Someone in your band hums as they mix red pigment with a little fat. Someone else strings small shells in 3 unfairly handsome orders, and then immediately undoes them because pattern is a form of weather that can't be rushed. The little fire writes upright commas on the ceiling that fall back down as drips tomorrow. Joke 3. Unite the drip as official cave percussionist, and promote the silence to conductor. Both accept. Historians still argue whether this very set of hills was a way station for people heading deeper into Eurasia or a destination briefly, with back and forth traffic, seasonal loops, and homecomings between Africa and the Levant whenever climate's doorbell rang. They wonder whether Meslia's old jaw tells a story of early arrival and retreat, or whether populations lingered, small but tenacious, teaching the caves a regular surname for many generations. Your feet cast their vote by being not in a hurry. Corridor or room, the cave keeps you warm tonight, which is the only decision that needs ratification before sleep. Before lying down, you practice the navigator's bedtime audit: water, coal, edge, sky, in that order. Water, tucked in stone shade, friendly. Coal, banked, traveling tomorrow. Edge, tools satisfied, sandals appeased. Sky, a slice of north framed by the mouth of the cave, the dipper still pouring certainty into an unseen horizon. You tuck the questions under your mat like letters for morning. The limestone leans in and breathes cool. Somewhere beyond the black silhouettes of pistachios a fox complains about the minutes. You pull your wrap up to your ears, borrow the cave's patience, and sleep under a ceiling that has already agreed to remember you kindly. The dunes ease their shoulders and you catch your first glimpse of a lake that forgot it lives in a desert. It lies there like a silver plate half buried in flour, wind writing tiny cursive along the margin. Reeds stitch the edges. Dragonflies patrol like small, neon librarians shushing the air. You squat, touch the skin of it, and your fingers report the outrageous news, cold. Arabia, yes. But tonight you've walked into a season when Arabia remembers how to be green. Your route becomes a lazy necklace of water bowls, the shallow pans locals later call playas, strung across the Nefud and beyond. Each basin keeps souvenirs, pale rings where old shorelines paused, drifts of freshwater shells that crunch under heel like delicate pottery, thin chalks where algae dried into history. You cut across the drive between lakes before heat sharpens its tongue, then sit in reeds at midday, watching wind wrinkle the surface into 1,000 soft decisions. Joke 1. You thank the lake for not evaporating in the middle of your drink. The lake replies by sending one mosquito as a receipt. Mainstream fact to set beside your water skin. During Pleistocene humid phases, monsoons pushed north and Arabia sprouted savannas, rivers, and lakes. In the Nefud Desert, ancient basins at Juba, Kalamation, and elsewhere held standing water. On one such paleolake at Al-Wasta, a modern human finger bone, a shy phalanx, was found in sediments dating to roughly 80-something thousand years ago, evidence that our people stood deep inside Arabia when the peninsula wore greener clothes. Not far away, at Alathar, a cluster of footprints, human, elephant, camel, stamp a brief story into wet mud around 120,000 years ago. Thirsty animals and passing people sharing the same pause. You walk the circumference because lakes are also compasses. The downwind shore talks in taller reeds. The upwind side leaves ripple marks on stranded silts like music notation. Where the shoreline bulges inward, you find a fresh seat that tastes less like limestone and more like patience. Children invent a game of hopping the tufa, little ledges where minerals built tiny white shelves, and you permit exactly 3 hops before declaring a bathrobe hour for everyone's ankles. The reeds consent to be tools and you twist a cord that dries strong. A mat begun at one lake will be finished 2 basins later, because nomadry is just domestic work given long legs. Historians still argue whether these green pulses powered the big dispersals or simply decorated a longer, mostly coastal trend. Were interior routes the main highways, or seasonal detours, a way to cut across dunes when clouds remembered generosity? They also argue how many waves actually filtered through one grand population versus several pulses, some advancing, some retreating, leaving cousin toolkits at places like Jebel Faya in the UAE or in Dhofar to the south. Your feet are happy to let them discuss nomenclature. Your feet care about shade and repeatable water. You learn Arabia's household tricks. Follow busted footprints at dawn, and you're likely to earn a plate of seeds thrown on the ground by accident. Watch for dung beetles rolling perfect planets. Their chosen slope points away from the wettest ground. Smell for acacia honey in the air, a tiny amber rumor that somebody else has already mapped the flowers. You help cut a channel from a puddle to shallows where children practice their swallow dives and discover that the lake answers to gentle requests if you make them with the flattest of sticks. Mainstream truth, second cup. Arabia's ancient lakes left geology that remembers. Shoreline berms, diatomaceous silts, and tufa buildups, plus animal bones that shouldn't be here if this were always a land for only thorn and sand. Think elephant, hippopotamus in some records, large camel, horse, big drinkers. The stone nearby carries lithic accents, prepared cores, points, and flakes that sometimes resemble the Nubian complex known from northeast Africa, leading some researchers to see people moving, others to see ideas converging. You test the edge where the playa returns to dry. A wind comes across with the smell of wet gypsum and a suggestion of thunder in another county. You raise a palm and wonder if it will find you. It doesn't. Arabia specializes in distant promises and near certainties. Tonight the certainty is a flat place under a tamarisk where the stars will do their reliable sealing act. Joke 2. You award the tamarisk Employee of the Month for improvising an umbrella in a region that forgets to issue them. A quirky tidbit rides in on the breeze. After good rains, the sand may gift you desert truffles, round, pale fungi that smell like a bakery discovering philosophy. You'll dig 3 false alarms for every real one and smile anyway when the knife hits something that whispers give. No one writes a paper about you eating truffles on a green Arabian afternoon. Your band will remember it longer than any date. Historians still argue whether the footprints at Alathar were made by our species or another human neighbor, and whether the finger bone at Al Wusta represents a passing through or a season after season use of the interior by a group who learned the lake's moods. They debate whether reconstructions lean too coastal because many old beaches lie underwater now, or too interior because lakes leave pretty, legible rings that seduce maps. That's the sober part. The sleepy part is this. Both lanes existed, and people who could memorize the sky could memorize 2 kinds of water. You mark time by shorebird schedules. When Avocet's legs look especially absurd, the light is almost right. When egrets stand like broken punctuation near the backwater, you know the day is politely retired. The group's chores follow water logic. Fill skins before gossip, skim algae after shade arrives, build fly screens with rush mats if the evening decides to be social in the wrong way. The lake plays metronomes so you don't have to. Mainstream truth's third ripple. The interior route does not cancel the coast. It echoes it. In times when Bab el-Mandeb's corridor felt fussy and the Red Sea's winds invented speeches, the interior lakes and savannas let people move inland, then rejoin coasts farther east. In dry spells, the Seine basins knotted sand and silence into fences that herded travelers back to shoreline certainty. Migration wasn't a single thread. It was a braid tied and untied by rain. As twilight catches up with you, the lake turns mirror smooth and begins rehearsing the night. You can see the first stars practice their entrances in the water before they take the sky proper. Someone in your band tosses a stone, and the ripples erase Orion for a heartbeat, then stitch him back together. Joke 3. You bow and apologize to Orion for interrupting his performance. He declines to descend to the level of your humor. Before you lie down, you perform the usual sleep arithmetic. Lake downwind so bugs choose someone else. Fire small so stars can run the show. Skins topped, coal banked, edges tidy. You rub a smear of mud along sandal straps to keep them from arguing with your feet tomorrow. The wind decides to behave. The reeds have said everything they meant to say. Out over the flat, a fox draws an invisible line and walks it to prove it can. You close your eyes with one more modest, useful picture. Arabia as a polka dot map of wet. Lake, 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 blinked on by climate and blinked off again. Never all at once, never permanently. When lights were on, people moved between them the way you just did, slowly, sleepily, with a hand always checking the skin at your hip and another hand pointing, without drama, at a star that has never been north for everyone, but is north enough for tonight. The dunes sigh. The water forgets you gently. The sky holds. You keep the sea on your left shoulder and let it behave like a friendly hallway. The surf doesn't shout. It whispers in cycles you can count without looking. Between the low stone headlands, mangroves spread their green handwriting into shallow creeks, and the creeks write back with titylines, a chalk mark of salt, a lace of foam, the smooth shine of wet flats where snails sign their names and erase them again. You are on the Indian Ocean coastal highway, which is not a road so much as a rhythm. The rule set is simple: walk when the tide is polite, stop when it is vain, eat the intertidal in between. Your feet approve of the policy. You learn to hear reef grammar. A distant hiss means a sandbar taking attendance. A sharper crack means a small surf over rock teeth. A soft glug says a channel shoulder with deeper water and cooler ankles. The mangrove nematophores, those little snorkel roots, become a tide clock. When they show half their height, you can cross the flats as if walking a shelf. When just their knuckles peak, you brew tea and mend things. You carry a loop of cord on your wrist for quick lashings, reed bundles, net corners, a basket of bivalves that like the idea of being dinner. Joke 1. You promote the cord to deputy of everything and it replies by being cord, which is excellent management. Mainstream fact to keep in your pocket like a shell. During glacial lows, sea level dropped, widening the continental shelf and turning today's drowned beaches into broad terraces and lagoons. Many early camps and middens would now be underwater, which helps explain why the archaeological trail along this littoral feels like a sentence with missing words. On the Arabian side, stone tool traditions at places such as Jebel Faya, UAE, include assemblages dated to MIS 5, roughly 125 to 80,000 years ago, that some researchers see as cousins to African Middle Stone Age methods. Farther east, in India, sites like Chwalapuram preserve Middle Paleolithic layers before and after the Toba volcanic ash, around 74,000 years ago, showing local people navigated a big sky event and kept their tool habits. The shoreline path you're walking has evidence, but it is patchy because the ocean later tidied the floors. You travel with tides as timetables and monsoons as semesters. On the shoulder seasons, you drift past perfumed belts of sea lettuce and sargassum, through estuaries where milkfish flicker and mullet gossip in silvery commas. When the winds stiffen, you pause under a headland and let the land's microclimate tuck you in. Date palms whispering, a spring pulsing politely from limestone, a southwest breeze bargaining with your fire to please be smaller. A shortcut might exist inland, but the coast offers water, starch, salt, and news, and old travelers grade routes on those four subjects more than on distance. Historians still argue whether this coastal way was primary highway or auxiliary lane. Did most dispersing bands hug beaches through Oman, Makran, and Kutch towards Saurashtra and beyond? Or did they braid coastal days with inland river corridors and oasis chains? They also argue over Jebel Fayya's resemblance to African toolkits. Does similarity mean people moved? Or that stone has limited jokes when you want specific edges? And the Toba debate runs on. Big eruption, yes. Continental reset, probably not. The strongest bedtime version is modest. Multiple lanes, used in different seasons by small groups whose superpower was being reasonable. You keep reasonable hours. Dawn is gleaning time. Oysters, arc shells, whelks hiding where the last ripple forgot to leave, each pried with a wedge of chert and twisted open with a piece of mangrove. Noon is shade and mending, nets strung between roots, floats shaved from driftwood, sinkers knotted from rounded pebbles. Dusk is walking, the flat water turned into mercury lanes, the sky rolled thin and pink as a shell lip. Someone keeps a clam shell full of ember under seaweed. Someone else watches the rip currents by reading the seams, the slick, the foam, the line of bubbles that insist on going somewhere in a hurry. You assign a watcher not because the sea is mean, but because it is busy. Mainstream truth, second wave, where evidence survives above water, the coast leaves middens, rubbish heaps with a gourmet bias for shell and fish bone, and work floors with fish spines, notched flakes, and the polish of net weights. In Arabia, many such heaps are Holocene, younger, but Pleistocene coastal living also shows up in patchy form along the Red Sea and in parts of the Arabian Sea margin. In South Asia, later caves and dunes preserve tool traditions and useware that fit a forager's shore and river diet, even when the exact beach is long gone under blue. Quirky tidbit: you dry cuttlebone, the chalky float from squid cousins, to shave into fire starters and polishers. They smell faintly like the word harbor, when warmed, and leave a soft chalk ideal for marking knots or counting tides. Another coastal trick: a smear of seaweed gel on sandal thongs quiets the salt rash that likes to argue with ankles. The headlands teach navigation without stars when clouds decide to practice drama. Wave refraction wraps patterns around capes. If you follow the converging ripples, you find the lee beach before your shoulders file a grievance. Seabirds provide editorial notes. Terns draw straight lines to bait fish. Oyster catchers patrol the exact rib of mussel beds you want. Frigates lick the slipstream under squalls like experienced bureaucrats. You hum the old route songs anyway. Names for inlets and bars. Jokes about mud that alphabetizes your toes. Because music keeps feet in a civil pace. Historians still argue whether the lineages that would later be called M and N, branches from African L3, spread east and north mostly along these southern coasts or widely through multiple inland corridors, then fan to the shore in regional mosaics. Genetics shakes its head gently and says, the population history is braided. The neat arrow you draw across the map is a bedtime simplification. You accept the correction and keep walking, because you're telling a sleep story, not filing a grant. You pass Makran cliffs where the land rises like a folded rug, then leans back into blue. Rain-cut gullies offer sweetwater lenses if you dig at the right curve of beach. Past the headlands, flats open into great salt pans rimmed by sabka crust, delicate plates that crack with the small, satisfying music of breakfast cereal. You skirt the edges and pretend you planned the crunch to stay this consistent. Joke 2. You elect the Sabka Minister of Sound Effects and everyone applauds with their feet. Mainstream truth, third shell. Wherever coasts served as corridors, they also served as kitchens and message boards. Shell beads, Nacerius, Dentalium, and their cousins, turn up across the Indian Ocean rim, sometimes far inland, suggesting visits, gifts, and distant cousins who like the same small shine. You swear on tiny drilled holes tells you the beads worked for a living, worn and rethreaded, not just collected and forgotten. Even when beaches moved, the habit moved with people. By the time the Gulf of Kutch and Saurashtra appear as a low blue rumor on the horizon of your imagination, you've learned the coastal algorithm so well your feet do it without asking. Watch tide, read wind, glean, mend, walk, repeat. Inland, monsoons rehearse their larger drama. Out here, you experience the monsoon as service intervals. Days when wind is an ally and days when it requests you sit under a dune and tell stories. You take the request. You're good at waiting productively. Quirky tidbit number 2. You keep a tidal abacus. 5 small shells on a string. Slide one for each turn of the tide since a campsite, another for each good flat cross. When all shells sit at the knot, it's time to look for a creek with fresh water and short mangroves, a sign of less salt. It's not technology in the modern sense. It's polite memory you can hang from your belt. Night falls a different color here, dark cyan on the sea, pewter on the mudflats, a black varnish on headlands where crabs walk sideways like scribes racing a deadline. The stars rejoin the story with their usual confidence. But you don't need them as much when foam and ripple tell you where to put your feet. You draw the evening small, fire low, embers banked, skins topped, edges tidy. A quick tug test on the raft lashings you might need tomorrow. Joke 3. You salute a stubborn oyster that took 3 tools and a parable to open, then appointed director of security for the midden. It refuses to comment because it's now soup. Before sleep, you store one last gentle picture. This long, salt-flavored lane carrying tiny households east, past Oman headlands and the Makran shelves and into India, not in a hurry, not as conquest, but as a moving picnic that replenishes itself. Starch from tubers behind the dunes, protein from shell and fish, salt from the air itself. If tomorrow's wind says rest, you'll rest. If it says walk, you'll walk with the sea in your ear like a metronome. You don't have to wind. The waves make their old soft argument for continuity. You accept, yawn, and let the coast tuck you in. Rains don't just arrive. They retune the room you walk through. The air thickens until your skin feels like a thoughtful drum, and then the monsoon knocks, big, generous, and slightly theatrical. You tilt your head to let the first fat drops drum your temple. Petrichor rises the way a crowd rises to a chorus. Dust turns to clay syllables underfoot. The wind takes off its shoes. You adjust your schedule without needing a meeting. Mornings become foraging and moving, middays belong to string and smoke, evenings are talk under a roof that suddenly has a lot to say. The subcontinent is a long, angled table of rivers and ridges, and the monsoon pours water from the southeast corner and the southwest edge like a host who believes in generous servings. You learn the Godavari's moods. The way its side channels keep shy fish after the crest passes. You learn that the Krishna smells different before dawn and after. You learn that river gravels gift you a new flint every 100 paces if you look with the right kind of boredom. You pitch light shelters in rock shelter mouths and along levees under tamarind shade, where a back eddy writes a polite essay about how not to drown. Mainstream fact to tuck by your damp sandals. At Jwalapuram, Andhra Pradesh, layers of Middle Paleolithic stone tools lie beneath and above the ash of the Toba eruption, 74,000 years ago, suggesting people here persisted across the event and kept napping in familiar styles when the sky had its tantrum. Far to the southeast at Adirampakkam, evidence hints that a Middle Paleolithic begun long before Toba matured into later habits, and by the late Pleistocene, microblade toolkits appear widely across India. Tiny, efficient edges that sit neatly in wood or bone handles like thoughts snapping into sentences. The story isn't a reset, it's weathering and revision. You fall into monsoon tempo. The ground gushes in the morning and steams by noon. You move camp by contour, not far, just high enough that laughter doesn't require a boat. In a rock shelter, the drip line keeps time. You hang a leaf gutter from a vine to refill pots and name it, with due ceremony, the minister of small rivers. It performs admirably until a macaque decides to reassign it to toy, at which point you promote a second leaf and pretend succession planning was always the idea. Joke 1. You applaud the cloud bank for its strong percussion section and award it director of drums. The cloud replies by tightening the rhythm. Historians still argue whether Toba caused a severe population bottleneck that echoes in our genes or merely made an angry layer cake that people stepped around while keeping their local traditions. They also debate whether the spread of microblades across the subcontinent marks new arrivals fanning in from elsewhere or local innovation that blossomed when humidity and mobility favored modular tools you can carry in quivers of stone. And they argue, because scholars are kind to rain by keeping busy indoors, how often the coastal highway and the river corridors braided, unbraided, and braided again as seasons change their manners. You practice waiting as a skill. On rain days, cords grow from your fingers, bast fibers teased from bark and nettle cousins, twisted into lines that don't sulk when wet. Nets learn new knots. Baskets fatten their rims. Fire behaves if you treat it like a baby, little, fed often, protected from tantrums by a wind baffle of stones. Quirky tidbit for your pocket. You paint grease on a stretch of plaited cord and run it once through ash. The cord stops squeaking when it rubs on a branch and the whole camp decides your engineering degree is official. Mainstream truth. Second cup of tea. Monsoon country is a place of forager camps that return to good addresses. Rock shelters with dry benches. Think Bhimbetk's neighborhood later famous for paintings. Island bars that reappear after water recedes. And river terraces where the gravel never runs out of opinions for making edges. Seasonal shell scatters and fish bones show inland people taking slow advantage of swollen backwaters, while tool use wear on scrapers and points speaks of wet hide work. Rain is tough on seams and morale, so stitches and jokes compete to hold the world together. Your navigation drops from stars to sounds during cloud weeks. Instead of the dipper, you steer by the rain sheets hiss on bamboo, by the bullfrog's bass line announcing where the pond grew shoulders, by the whistle of parakeets when the squall lifts and seeds become available again. When the sky clears at night, you check your ceiling like a sailor grabbing a familiar railing. Ursa there, Scorpius stretched long and smug, and then you go back to counting water beats as if they were all the constellations you require. Historians still argue whether the Middle Paleolithic in India ties neatly to African Middle Stone Age traditions through movement, or arrived via long conversations of neighboring groups testing flaking strategies along shared river avenues. They also ask whether the microblade turn tracks climate, population density, or social networks that made small, standard parts fashionable in the tool economy. Your camp loves any explanation that concludes sharp, fixable, pocketable, because wet weeks punish awkward cargo. Food dances to rain. Termite alates, those winged optimists, erupt after the first big storm, and children perform the age-old sprint with woven baskets, scooping protein that literally falls from the sky. Tubers swell and stop arguing with your stomach. You roast them and leave packets in the sand beside the fire until they go from starchy lecture to sweet apology. Rivers loan you catfish with their whiskers tuned to opportune corners. Your lines learn their language. Joke 2. Unite an especially opinionated catfish. Inspector of knots. When it tests and passes every lash in your kit by attempting escape. Mainstream truth. Third note. Across peninsular India, late Pleistocene sites record microblade industries sitting with grindstones and edgeware consistent with plant processing, suggesting mixed diets. River fish, small game, gathered seeds and roots, managed across monsoon calendars. The toolkits shrink in size but swell in versatility. When rain moves the goalposts daily, the smartest answer is a kit that moves with it. You start naming camps by sound. Rock shelter of the double drip, island bar that smells like cinnamon, to mash of parakeets. These aren't on any later atlas, but your knees remember their coordinates exactly. When the ground becomes impractical, you upgrade from walking to loitering productively. A day for mending, a day for pitch experiments with tree resins and ash, a day for inventing rain songs that measure time better than any string of shells. You float a small reed raft across a calm backwater to rescue a proud but imprudent basket. Joke 3. You promote the raft to acting bridge and the title sticks until the sun returns. Historians still argue whether the subcontinent saw one principal wave of modern humans early, with later local continuity, or several arrivals, some coastal first, some river first, whose descendants braided into the M and N genetic lineages that keep showing up east and north. They keep their voices low while they argue because the rain is loud, and the rain has seniority in any conversation here. At dust the storm pages itself out of the sky, and the rock shelter's lip frames a new washed green that looks temporarily immortal. Bats write quick italics across the mouth of the cave. A slow fire cooperates. Steam lifts from your tunic like a spirit that decided to stay. You take the bedtime census. Water found, coal tucked, edges happy sky, if visible, still where you left it last dry spell. You make a small mark on a pebble, a private tally of big rains endured, and slip it into your basket so the count travels. The sleep lesson refuses to be complicated. The monsoon doesn't end the journey. It teaches it to slow down until waiting becomes as much migration as walking. You carry forward the portable parts, knots, songs, microblades, quiet jokes, and let the rest be weather. When the sky opens tomorrow, you'll follow the river's new handwriting downstream and call it north because north, in your language, often just means the next good place to rest. The frogs keep the beat. The shelter arranges your breath. The rain becomes a lullaby no one had to write. You follow the coast until the map under your feet starts changing scale. Shorelines braid into deltas, deltas braid into islands, and the islands hold hands across water that never quite sits still. On days with kind light you can see that much of what looks like ocean is really a drowned plain. A shelf the sea borrowed when ice grew impatient elsewhere. You are walking the rim of Sunda, the big, shallow platform that once tied mainland Southeast Asia to Sumatra, Java, and Borneo. At low seas, it's grass and river. At higher seas, it's mangrove and glitter. Either way, it argues, come this way, but pack a plan for crossing. Your pace shifts from tide logic to channel logic. Rivers like Mahakam and Kapuas pour brown lace through the green. Estuaries breathe sweet at dawn and brackish at noon. You learn the shelf trick of seeing sandbars before your eyes do. Watch how the wavelets kneel, how the color tilts from bottle green to tea. When the shelf gives way to deep lanes, the water changes voice from purr to throat. Even your ankles can hear the step down. Joke 1. You politely file a request with the Department of Less Pushy Waves. The waves accept your form and continue their career unchanged. Mainstream fact to put by your travel cup: throughout the Pleistocene, lowered sea levels fused Sumatra, Java, Borneo, Malay Peninsula into Sunda, but the deep straits east of that platform never closed. Between Bali and Lombok, between Borneo and Sulawesi, and across the Flores and Timor seas, water stayed blue and serious. Biologists later call one of those invisible fences the Wallace Line, because plants and animals on either side don't match. Tigers and orangutans on the west, marsupials and cockatoos on the east's doorstep. To pass from Sunda into Walsea, that scatter of islands between Asia's shelf and Sahuls, you must make real sea crossings, even when ice hoards water. You treat crossings like chores that happen to sparkle. Rafts mean bundled bamboo, lash trunks, skins as floats if you have them, and timing, always timing. The Indonesian through flow leans water from the Pacific toward the Indian Ocean. Channels suck and sigh in rhythms you can feel in your knees. You learn to leave at slack, aim for island shadows that tame crosswinds, and keep a coal wrapped in damp leaves because sea air loves to steal fire. A swimmer clips a cord loop across their chest and strokes like someone who pays attention. The youngest child is put in charge of counting songs: 7 to the bar, 5 to the lee beach, 3 to the shade you promised you'd find. Historians still argue whether the first modern human push into Wallacea preferred a southern route, from Timor and its neighbors toward northwest Australia, or a northern arc, through Sulawesi to Halmahera and the Bird's Head of New Guinea. They also argue whether those early voyages were accidental drifts that happened to end well or planned crossings with wayfinding baked in: stars, swells, birds, and the confidence to aim for land you cannot see. Your raft votes for planning by packing spare lashings and a joke quota. Evening puts you in a karst island with caves that breathe cool air and bat scent. You light damar resin on a stick. It smells like pine remembering sugar, and the flame writes amber commas on the limestone. The cave returns them as drips tomorrow. A hush falls when someone raises a hand, presses it against the wall, and puffs pigment around the fingers. When the hand drops, the stencil stays, negative space that reads like a roll call. We were here. We kept fire. We had hands, and they made edges in boats. Mainstream fact with a steady flame. In Sulawesi, hand stencils and animal paintings dated with calcite crusts fall in the 40 to 45,000 year neighborhood, and beyond, among the oldest known figurative art. In Borneo, deep in Lubang Jeriji Sala, reddish hand stencils and figures live in similar time. The art tells you the islands were not just fairies. They were rooms where nights mattered. Quirky tidbit for your pocket. In these caves, tiny mud wasps build papery nests right on old paintings. Later, calcium drizzles over wasp work and paint alike. Those mineral skins are clocks. People with careful drills read their uranium-thorium ratios to learn when the crust grew, bracketing when the art must be older than the crust. You fall asleep entertained by the notion that wasps, water, and radioactivity became your archivists. Outside, the forest at night is a sound library. Geckos clicking like mischief, megabats jotting in high notes, a ground dove saying I object not to you but to a snake you cannot see. You set your bed under a drip line that doesn't drip, a skill you learned by listening rather than looking. Joke 2. You promote a stalactite to acting metronome of the camp when it hits a leaf in perfect time. Plink, plink, plink. And everyone agrees the tempo is moderate, and sleep-forward.by day you rehearse wayfinding you can explain to a child. Swells come in long blue paragraphs. Read them with your hips. Clouds pile over land by afternoon. Aim for the tallest anvil that repeats. Birds commute. Frigate birds hang over deep lanes. Terns draw straight lines to bait. Fruit pigeons climb toward forests you can't yet see. You smell fresh water before you taste it. Mangroves sour green breath fading to leaf and stone when a spring is near. The sky becomes confirming evidence, not a solo act. Mainstream truth. Second island, Wallacea held older cousins long before you. Think Homo floresiensis on Flores, with tools layered under and over volcanic tufts, and shows repeated visitations by hominins who figured out local edges. By the time your people came through, the islands were already classrooms in how to make do with little wood and many opinions. The boats got better, the crossings longer, the confidence steadier. Historians still argue whether population sizes in these first island hops were big enough to guarantee survival across generations without backflow from Sunda. Whether bands leapfrogged rapidly in a few centuries or ambled for millennia. Whether caves with paintings were ritual rooms or simply good living rooms that collected meaning the way shelves collect bowls. They also debate how often people returned west when winds flipped. Islands can be one-way bridges, but cultures with seasonal memory tend to keep return tickets tucked in their baskets. You learn the craft economy of islands. Bamboo is both beam and bottle. Rattan is rope if you ask nicely and whip it once through ashes to take the squeak away. Shell makes passable scrapers and fishhooks. Boar tusk makes jewelry that smells like forest and brag. Fires prefer tiny, because tiny respects trees that grew slow. Your raft lashings get a rub of fish oil to keep salt's tantrums in check. Quirky tidbit number 2. To test the new bundle's buoyancy, you drop a stone token of known sulk into a lagoon, and watch how long it takes to vanish. The bundle that buys you the longest song wins the job. Acting bridge. Acting bridge is the highest title a bundle can hold. At a strait you cannot see across. Call it Flores Sea or Timor Sea depending which vowel your feet choose. You plan like people who like mornings more than heroics. Neap tide means smaller pulse. Dawn gives you a wind slack before the sea breeze wakes. You cache sweet water under shade near the launch, so if the wind throws a mood, you can pretend you were always going to wait a day. Children get jobs, counting clouds, minding embers, announcing birds, not because you need their help, but because jobs turn fear into rhythm. Mainstream truth, third wave, whether by the southern Timor route or the northern Sulawesi, Halmahera arc, human presence moves through Wallacea early, and very soon after, or even overlapping with these arts, Sahul, Australia, New Guinea when seas are low, starts keeping campfire accounts of its own. That is the next chapter. Tonight, you're simply pleased that islands beyond easy sight of land are not mythical. They're reachable if you aim, count, and respect wind. Joke 3 floats by when a flying fish nearly volunteers into the raft, looks you in the eye midair as if to say, I thought you were water, and departs in a hurry. You appoint it Undersecretary for confusing mornings and receive no resignation letter. Camp again, and a cave again, and the hand stencil you at tonight overlaps a bore someone else puffed in red. You smile at the cooperation across decades. The resin torch pops once, the bats adjust their chorus, and the limestone edits your echoes until your voice sounds like it grew here. You check the usual 4, water, coal, edge, sky, and the sky, even filtered through a cave mouth, answers with its old north disguised among different stars. You sleep with a nautical map printed on your skin memory, swell under hip, wind on cheek, bird line at dawn, cloud anvil at noon. The raft waits outside like a quiet promise. The sea continues its long career as corridor and kitchen. Wallasea doesn't feel like an obstacle. It feels like a very long, very interesting porch you cross one tile at a time. You wake to a sea that looks like it misplaced half its water. The horizon sits closer than it should, as if the planet tucked its blue bedsheet under itself and forgot a corner. You are standing on the lip of Sunda, looking across to Sahul, Australia and New Guinea fused by low seas into one broad, ochre and emerald continent. The gaps between you and that new room are not nothing, but they are crossable if you keep your nerve and your lashings honest. You run a hand over the raft you tied last evening and feel the day's question answer itself. Yes, if we start at dawn. You've learned this choreography. Watch the swell, read the wind, aim at cloud anvils that prefer to form over warm land, count your songs. The water here speaks several dialects, tidal murmur, channel breath, open lane baritone, and your hips translate them while your eyes do their own work. Frigate birds scissor the sky. Where they linger, deep water is underfoot. Where turns make straight lines, bait is being bullied near a shore you may not see yet. The raft hums under load. The coal, packed in damp leaves, rides in a shell bowl like a small monarch carried in a palanquin of seaweed. Mainstream fact to lay beside the paddle. When ice fattened at high latitudes, sea level fell enough to fuse Australia and New Guinea into Sahul. But deep channels remained between Sunda and Wallasea, and again between Wallasea and Sahul. Crossings, dozens of kilometers at minimum, were unavoidable. Yet people made them. By the time you're sliding off your launch beach, rock shelters like Majbib and Arnhem Land will one day hold hearths and tools that date to roughly 65 to 50,000 years ago, arguing that humans arrived in northern Australia early and settled down to the ordinary business of being clever. In the far southeast, the Willandra Lakes will keep quiet watch over burials near Lake Mungo. People remembered in sand and ochre around 42,000 years ago. Proof that the new continent filled with footsteps quickly and widely. The crossing today is a morning, not a saga. You time it for slack, count 7 songs to a stitch of cloud that thickens into a low island, then 5 more to a lee where coral becomes pantry and dissertation at once. Joke 1. A flying fish launches, smacks you square in the shoulder like a wet compliment, and you promote it to acting coach of motivation. It declines to stay for rehearsal. Land in Sahul has a smell you haven't catalogued yet. Ironstone warmed to a bakery's patience. Eucalyptus gossiping. A dust note that tastes like a well-behaved campfire. Your feet meet stone country in the top end. crumpled escarpments whose ledges store shade and whose drip lines write thin, cool sentences across the heat. You camp in a rock shelter where the wall shows stenciled hands, barramundi with bellies like silver stories, and yam figures sketched as if the pantry itself wanted a portrait. You keep your torch small. This isn't a museum night, it's a kitchen night. Water, fire, food, sleep. Historians still argue whether arrival here was a single strong wave or several pulses over millennia, some taking a southern to more route toward the Kimberley and Arnhem Land, others tracing a northern arc via Sulawesi and New Guinea before easing south. They also argue about timing, whether the oldest dates at places like Majbib push human presence back toward the mid-60,000s, or whether the more conservative band in the 50,000s clears its throat and asks for a little humility. And they keep their voices low while discussing megafauna. How much of the big animal goodbye was climate stress versus human burning, hunting, and just existing? The shelter listens politely and offers no citations. You learn Sahel by edges and water. In the north, late wet season billabongs shrink into great platters of life, fish stranded in easy paragraphs, magpie geese bickering like cousins, lily seeds waiting in patient drifts. You can walk sunrise circuits with a spear and a basket and return convinced the landscape is generous when treated as a long conversation, not an argument. Inland, the monsoon sorts the year into wide chapters, fat green months that ask you to move gently and blue months that ask you to move far. The stars you used to steer become company more than instruments. The Magellanic clouds trail you like kind stray dogs, and the crux, the Southern Cross, learns to be your hinge when the dipper retires behind other horizons. Quirky tidbit to tuck under your belt. The grasses here, spinifex, bristly as an opinionated elder, hide a glass-clear resin you can lift, warm, and mold to glue stone to wood. You need resin with charcoal and a smear of ochre until it stops sulking, then press it around the blade's tang while the coal you carried across the sea turns itself back into fire for the ceremony. Later generations will teach 1,000 variations: beeswax with paperbark ash, resins sweetened with kangaroo dung for flex. But tonight the glue sets with a faint piney whisper, and your spear becomes itself. Mainstream Truth's second lamp. In the southeast, at Willandra, people honored their dead with ochre long ago. Mungo Lady and Mungo Man lie within a lunette of ancient lake sand whispering 40,000 plus years. Across northern Australia, deeply stratified shelters preserve long stacks of hearths, flakes, and grinding hollows that say we stayed and kept tidying. In New Guinea's highlands, much later, archaeologists will read early gardening in the soil, but even in Pleistocene time you can feel altitude's promise. Stone that flakes with a satisfying ring, couscous announcing itself by plant collateral damage, cold streams that taste like clean decisions. Historians still argue whether those first navigators arrived with sailing knowledge robust enough to target invisible land deliberately, or whether crossing chains of islands let short-hop logic accumulate into an outcome that looks grander on maps than it felt on mornings. They also ask whether early burning, patchwork fires that make fresh green for wallabies and coax tubers to fatness, scaled up into landscape engineering quickly or slowly. Your camp votes for practical, small burns in the shoulder season, fire as housekeeping, not theater. You find your feet liking stone country staircases more than beach miles for a while. Up on the escarpment, the wind stops arguing and learns to be a fan. Rock pools hold sky for your elbows. At noon, Someone teaches you to test a cycad seed for bitterness, to slice and soak and leach away the scolding until starch remains. Work that feels like patience wearing an apron. The night returns your patience with planets you can nearly believe are for you alone. Joke 2. A wallaby decides to attend camp uninvited, stares at your fire with the literary disappointment of a critic, and you appoint a deputy of pacing because it kangaroons with such authority. You keep the travel kit deliberately small. Microblades. Tiny sharp opinions snap into wooden handles with resin collars. A string bag of grass cord materializes from time you thought you didn't have. Ochre lumps live wrapped like sweets in paper bark, ready to mark a body or a wall or a memory that refuses to be only in brains. The raft lashings get a maintenance sermon every few days because salt loves to be the villain in quiet stories. The coal you carried becomes a lineage of hearth children, each teaching the next how to sit and glow without tantrums. Mainstream truth, third ember. The archipelago fringe of New Guinea and Australia holds very old traces of people who know boats and tides. On islands ringing the Sahul shelf, shell middens, quarries, and work floors appear as soon as sea levels stabilize enough to stop bulldozing their own archives. Inland, dune chains and lake margins preserve camps that move like breath, returning on circuit to promises kept. Water here, shade there, tubers when the flowers lie about their generosity. Historians still argue whether the speed of spread across Sahul was lights on fast, a few thousand years from first landfall to southern shores, or slow and braided, different coasts and inland corridors lighting at their own tempos. They debate whether early art takes its first deep root in the north with hand stencils and animal figures or appears simultaneously across several regions, uncoordinated but inevitable. They do not argue about whether people slept better near fresh water. Everyone knows that's just gravity with an ethics degree. The ordinary becomes the spectacular once the map can't brag about you anymore. You smoke fish until sunset decides to admit color. You grind a little sulcrete and a little quartzite and teach a child to hear when stone says yes. You mark the seasons not only by the Southern Cross pivoting but by paperbark peeling, by bandicoot tracks reappearing after rain, by stingrays lifting tails out of shallows like casual punctuation. Joke 3. You salute a stubborn oyster that requires 3 men, 2 wedges, and a parable to open, and appointed minister of security for the midden. It accepts the portfolio and becomes dinner anyway, which is how most ministers should end. Before sleep you run the quiet audit one more time. Water, billabong honest and not sulking. Coal, banked under ash as if it always lived here. Edge, tools sharp, resin smug, bad cords not plotting to elope. Sky, a new ceiling, but still a ceiling you can read. Somewhere to the east the hills of New Guinea are shouldering clouds. Somewhere to the south dunes at a dry lake are learning your footprints. You roll onto your side and feel the continent accept you like a polite host who also intends to teach you things you didn't know you needed. You close your eyes on a map that no longer looks like an arrow but like a spread of lamps. Africa's long night lights, Arabia's lakes, India's monsoon caves, Wallach's torchlit caverns, and now Sahul's hearths, small and stubborn, each a yes. North became east, became south, became here. The raft dries in the dark. The resin sets with a last faint sigh. The rock shelter cools until your breath and the stone agree on a rhythm. Sleep arrives punctual and barefoot, the way good guests do. Rivers turn the world into sentences you can read with your ankles. You step from tidal breath back onto land that has practiced meandering for 100,000 years, and the ground replies with terraces, old steps cut by water when it was younger and pushier. You climb one, then another, until the plain widens into paragraph and the sky decides to be generous again. To your right, a slow yellow water carries dust as if it were a language. To your left, a green, muscled southern river braids around stones that look like they remember singing. You follow the river roads into East Asia, because water here doesn't just quench, it points. You learn the Lus Plateau's handshake. Windblown silt stacks into butter-soft cliffs, and the river saws them into valleys with good manners. The banks wear pale bands, flood memories layered like quilts, so even if the channel sulks away, the walls whisper where it used to keep its promises. Your feet take the lower lines in autumn, the higher shelves in spring. You grow allergically accurate about where the melt will cheat first. Joke 1. You appoint the river deputy of useful hints, and it forms a committee of eddies to study your request. Mainstream fact to lay on a flat stone by your cup. The North China story leaves two prints and bones that say, our people came and stayed. Around Shwedangu, Ningxia, layers dated to roughly 40-odd thousand years ago record an initial Upper Paleolithic blade technology. Long blades punched from prepared cores, a look many scholars read as new habits arriving along these corridors. Far to the east near Beijing, at Tianyuan Cave, a modern human, 40,000 years, left bones and much later, ancient DNA that shows kinship with present-day East Asians and a strand that reaches into some Native American lineages. The rivers weren't just kitchens, they were avenues. You slip south, too, because the karst calls, limestone hills like sleeping animals, caves blinking cool air. The big southern river you befriend, call it Yangtze if labels help, switches registers every day, shoals gossip, gorges deliver sermons, backwaters hum lullabies. The cave mouths hold middens of shell and fish bone and chipped stone where bands return between flood theatrics. You learn to place your bed beyond the drip line but inside the wind's shyness, an architecture any bat could admire. In the morning, a mist lifts and leaves spider webs beaded like necklaces someone forgot to claim. Historians still argue whether modern humans arrived in East Asia in a swift wave before 50,000 years ago, or in earlier, exploratory pulses, some hinted by controversial finds like Fuyan's human-like teeth or Zirindang's modern chin, followed by later expansions that left deeper footprints. They argue how much the Shwedangu blades mean, people moving, or ideas hitchhiking, and whether the Nyawan Basin's long record represents continuity or roommates changing over deep time. The rivers shrugged politely. Whatever the tempo, they carried somebody north and east with enough confidence to keep making fires in the same clever places. You travel by confluence math. Big river plus right bank tributary equals stone of a certain color, equals flint nodules if the bank looks sulky, equals campsite tucked under willow gossip. Your group lends the land its household neatness. Fire small, coal banked, edges honest, skins topped, and in return the river makes navigation nearly gossip. Fish rise like punctuation. Egrets act like exclamation marks you're free to ignore. Quirky tidbit for your pocket. When the cattails burst and brush the air with yellow smoke, you hold a bowl under the heads and catch pollen, a soft flower you toast on a flat stone and stir into mash. It tastes faintly of afternoons and turns the camp into a bakery that misplaced its walls. A toddler appears wearing a pollen mustache and is promoted, on the spot, to Minister of Festivals. Mainstream Truth's second ripple. Caves and shelters across South China. Think Upper Cave at Zhoukoudian later, and a scatter of limestone rooms with late Pleistocene layers, archived grinding stones, flakes, charcoal scatters, and bone points that spell forager returns. In the north, microblades, tiny standardized edges, show up more and more by the late Pleistocene, snugged into slotted handles for kits that prefer repair over reinvention. Whatever route you took in, by 40,000 the river's margins read like a ledger of repeat visits. Historians still argue whether the Tianyuan individual represents a branch already distinct within Eurasia or part of a wider Pan-Asian network of kin, whether Denisovan heritage in modern populations filtered across these corridors in small sips or in larger cups farther south and in highlands to the west. The debate comes with careful charts. Your answer comes with a shoulder shrug and a soup spoon. You're here, the rivers run, the kit works. You adopt river etiquette. Cross at riffles where the water speaks quickly but shallow. Avoid cut banks in spring when the river edits its own margins with enthusiasm. Listen for the stone roll that announces a bed too busy for ankles. You string a fish weir with sticks and grass cord and watch the current do quiet labor. Joke 2. You appoint the weir acting accountant, and it presents a ledger of silvery commas, minnows, that add up to a paragraph stew. The Nyawan country reminds you that plains can be libraries, old lake basins rebuilt as meadows, with stone sources in arm's reach and views wide enough to see weather approaching with formal courtesy. You pick perch trees by their bird decisions, magpies like a certain elbow of branch, kites prefer lonely watchers, sparrows approve of ongoing meetings under thorn. At night, the Big Dipper leans low and the North Star returns to a familiar duty post, though you've learned by now that north is a committee decision between sky, water, wind, and what dinner thinks. Mainstream Truth, third shelf. As people spread along these rivers, fauna lists change. Deer and boar where mixed forest leans in, onager and gazelle near open steppe. Fish that write their own calendars into migration pulses you can set holidays by. Stone use where speaks hide scraping, plant slicing, bone drilling, hearth stack into thin black lines you could read with a fingertip. The cumulative message is not conquest. It's belonging by practice. Historians still argue whether climates flips into colder, drier beats push bands east and south, braid-like, or whether rivers tamed the chill enough that local traditions simply tightened their belts and stayed put. Some see bottlenecks, others see resilience with regional flavors. You don't referee. You count rising fish in bright mornings and judge the corridors by how often the kettle hums without incident. Quirky tidbit number 2. When the river ices at the edges, it sometimes grows frost flowers, curled ribbons of ice extruded from cracked stems and damp wood. You collect 3 as if they were messages from a polite winter and set them on a flat stone by the fire to watch them disappear responsibly. The child, minister of festivals, declares a holiday you observe by not slipping. The day's end audit, the one you always perform, feels particularly calm on river nights. Water, present and opinionated, but tractable. Coal, banked under ash the color of old parchment. Edge, blades reseated in handles with resin the shade of tea. Sky, a rectangle of north between poplars, the dipper pouring reassurance straight down the lane you plan to walk in the morning. Joke 3. You salute a carp that outwitted your weir, promoted to undersecretary for aquatic loopholes, and vow to close the loophole at dawn with one politely placed stick. As you lie back, the river takes on its night voice. Less splash, more breath. Bats throw italics across the mouth of the cave. Somewhere upstream, a beaver cousin edits a small channel without seeking committee approval. You let your ribs match the current's tempo and realize the lesson the water keeps repeating in a dozen dialects. Go where things already go, and take your household with you. When morning grays the sky, you will walk again, not because maps want arrows but because rivers love company, and you've become very good at being quiet company. You angle into a country that smells of beach leaves and rain on limestone, and your pace adjusts to the long sentences rivers write when they decide to be generous. The shore is behind you now. To your right the Black Sea breathes slow, heavy breaths. To your left, hills fold into karst like careful laundry. You keep to the Balkan corridors because they behave like indoor hallways, springs every few miles, caves that know how to hold temperature steady, and the big old Danube stating the obvious in a tone everyone can follow. You walk, you listen, you let water and stone do the pointing. The Danube is a teacher you don't have to look at to learn from. Terraces step down like old bleachers. Gravels tell you which bend will still be there after winter argues with itself. Willow's shade takes attendance in summer and calls recess in autumn. You move along its right bank and discover that the river has opinions about edges that happen to match yours. Cross at riffles, camp on low shelves when fog promises to keep its manners, climb to wine shoulders if the weather starts to tell jokes about your tent. Joke 1. You file a polite petition with the Commission for fewer mosquitoes. The river stamps it, received, and waves a small dragonfly as if that settles the matter. Mainstream fact to warm on a flat stone. Here in southeastern Europe, you start to meet our people in familiar rooms very early. At Bacho Kiro Cave in Bulgaria, layers around 45,000 years old hold remains identified as modern human, with stone blade production and ornaments that look like someone's first attempt at jewelry making as a habit. North along the river, caves and shelters accumulate a new blade logic, the so-called initial Upper Paleolithic with long blades struck from prepared cores, that many scholars read as fresh tool traditions moving with fresh faces. A little later, the Aurignacian, bone points, personal ornaments, a general fondness for beads and smooth music, takes stronger root. Your feet translate all this as, the kid is getting reparable, the nights are getting well lit, the neighbors are getting chatty. The forest insists you learn beach floor etiquette. Wet leaves slide like a joke your ankles don't appreciate. Dry leaves broadcast your location to boar who respect confidence but not clumsiness. You pick trails that deer have underlined with their hooves and step into caves that have names only when people have lived long enough nearby to name them. The drip line marks a half moon where the floor stays honest. A shelf at shoulder height turns into your ledger. Shells, a flake you like too much to use. A lump of ochre in case a night needs color. The room smells of wet stone, wood smoke, and the faint bitter plastic scent of birch tar when someone warms a scrap to soften glue. Quirky tidbit for your pocket. Someone in camp chews a pea-sized birch pitch to make it pliable, then pushes the softened tar around a blade tang with a slick stone. The chewer leaves tooth marks in the pitch. Centuries from now, curious people will read those bites like a signature and salvage ancient breath from them. Tonight it's just glue that behaves and a small joke about getting paid in splinters and compliments. You award the pitch the title acting diplomat of stone and wood. It accepts by sticking to your thumb. Historians still argue whether The early blade traditions moving up the Danube represent one wave or several pulses of modern humans. Whether the origination is a tidy package that spreads with people or a suite of ideas adopted by different bands at different speeds. They also spar gently over routes. Was the Danube corridor the prime causeway into the European interior? Or did a Black Sea littoral track carry households along the rim with fish and reeds as tutors until they turned inland? Your legs vote both. Your shoulders ask only that each day finish with water found and edges content. And the neighbors? You walk in a country that remembers Neanderthals kindly. Tools and layers below yours, ash lines that could be theirs, bones telling of a long tenure. The road you follow isn't empty. It's shared over time, with rooms alternately rented by different tenants depending on climate and chance. Mainstream truth's second ember. At sites like Oase in Romania, a little later, modern human bones carry a recent Neanderthal ancestor, a reminder that meetings sometimes became family. Your bedtime version sets the drama to mute, and hears only the household problem set. Who keeps the fire banked? Where to cache marrow? Whether to hang beads now or after tomorrow's rain. The Black Sea to your right offers fish calendars and mildness. To your left, the Carpathian shoulders keep a cool pocket of flint and shelter. You learn to trade spring water for salt air when throats need cheering and to swap beach for step when your kit demands speed. The Iron Gates gorge squeezes river and path together until your voice echoes back a sentence it wanted to say anyway. Go where the water goes, even when the walls pinch. You do politely. Historians still argue whether the Shadow Peronian farther west is a Neanderthal invention borrowing some ornament fashion or a mixing layer where ideas cross desks. Whether Yolusian kits in the south mark newcomers or neighbors getting creative. Your cave has no patience for footnotes. It asks simply that you hang the lamp where smoke can leave and laughter can stay. You practice river to forest logistics until they feel like a lullaby. In the morning the group becomes a foraging committee, red deer in the mist slot into the mental tally. Hazelnuts accrue like small coins. Trout talk in the riffles where you rock a weir into shape. At noon you assemble bone points that will forgive you later when you pry them out of a log with your knee. In the evening you comb sinew, burnish, and whisper to the glue until it accepts a second chance. Joke 2. The beech leaves under your bed insist on commentary with every shift. You appoint the floor minister of editorial notes, and it rustles approval. Mainstream truth, third fact to lean on. By 40 to 35,000 years ago, Europe grows busy with ornaments, bone tools, and hearths that stack into thin black lines you can trace with a fingertip. In some valleys, you will soon see ivory beads, flutes, and carved animals, a music and figurative turn often tied to the origination, though your path tonight keeps to the Balkans and Black Sea rim where the emphasis is still on getting in, getting along, and getting through winter with everyone's toes accounted for. You treat weather like a coworker you respect. When the Bora winds slant down the Dinaric heights, you choose Lee caves whose mouths face south as if they woke up wise. When the river fog becomes theater, you walk higher lines through oak and hornbeam, using pheasant chuckle calls to keep direction when the sun declines to assist. You note the fungus ledgers on fallen trunks, brackets tiered like stadium seating, and take the dry ones home to persuade embers to think big thoughts. The cave thanks you by smelling faintly of mushroom tea even when you didn't ask it to. Quirky tidbit number 2. You learn the old spruce gum trick. Warmed with a whisper of fat and peppered with ash, the gum becomes a fast-acting patch for a leaking skin bag or an impatient shoe seam. You tap the gum with a twig to test its readiness. If the twig comes away reluctant, the gum is ready. You promote it to deputy for sudden leaks and it accepts the office like a pro. Your navigation keeps mixing sky and local grammar. On clear nights, Ursa Major pours confidence. The North Star sits, still not exactly fixed over millennia, but fixed enough to let your feet calm down. On cloudy ones, you steer by the smell of cold water through trees, by the hush that tells you a terrace is near, by the sound a stone makes when a stream argues with it. Round stones gossip, flat stones sigh. You hum a route song that now includes loanwords, a Slavic-sounding syllable for a bend, a bird name that tastes Greek, because routes acquire accents before maps do. Historians still argue whether the pace of this entry, the spread from Balkans to Rhine and Iberia, was swift, lit like kindling, or patchy, with blank spaces that later light up because weather finally signed the permit. They dispute how many lineages carried the evening forward and how often you traded jeans and jokes with older residents. You smile into your cup because your camp's answer is always practice. Where the Danube says yes, you follow. Where forest sulks, you wait and make better chord. Dusk settles like a fur-lined hood. The cave's drip finds its metronome. The river lowers its voice to breath. Somebody strings canine teeth, wolf or fox, on a thong and the small clatter sounds like rain rehearsing. You do the usual audit because the audit is both ritual and reason. Water, present, cold enough to make elbows noble. Coal, banked under ash, promoted to tomorrow's lantern. Edge, bone point seated, birch tar smug, sinew combed and not plotting a walkout. Sky, a rectangle of north framed by beach tips. Polaris blinking consent even as the earth slowly nods around it. Joke 3 taps your shoulder when a hedgehog blunders into camp, freezes with the serious face of one who has forgotten why they came, then unfreezes and toddles behind the woodpile as if it owned stock in the operation. You appointed director of unscheduled inspections and everyone sleeps better knowing quality assurance has visited. You lie back and let the route stretch itself thin over your eyelids. Levant to Anatolia, Marmara to Balkans, Black Sea on your right, Danube whispering directions like an old friend who refuses to argue. The forest decides to hold its breath for 3 beats, then returns it to you, warm. Whatever the scholars decide about waves and packages, your experience of Europe starts the way all good wanderings start, by joining the habits of water, by borrowing caves that have already learned to be patient, and by walking slow enough that beads can be strung without losing the trail. Sleep collects you like drift settling into a quiet eddy. Morning will be there when you need it. The trees thin until they forget to be trees at all, and the world opens like a book that prefers wide margins. The wind stops arriving in gusts and becomes a low conversation that never runs out of topics. Grass to your knees, sedge to your shins, sky like a lid set a little higher than usual. You have walked onto the mammoth steppe, the high-latitude paths where cold and dry conspire to make plenty, a paradox that turns the horizon into a buffet for hooves. Your pace changes without asking permission. You lengthen your stride, you count in longer thoughts, you begin to measure distance by how often the reindeer lines cross your shadow. You learn the steps alphabet in a day. Lark notes fall like confetti you can't see the source of. Lemmings write punctuation beneath snow that hasn't yet auditioned for winter. The wind combs grass into arrows that point you toward a salt lick humans and bison both appreciate. The ground is lush in many places. powder fine silt laid down by ancient winds, which makes your boot prints look like careful calligraphy until one rude gust edits them. Joke 1. You lodge a formal complaint with the Department of Too Much Horizon. The Horizon accepts the paperwork and politely remains infinite. Mainstream fact to warm in your mitt. From France and Moravia clear across to Siberia, late Pleistocene bands traveled and camped on a steppe. Tundra biome rich in big grazers. Mammoth, woolly rhinoceros, horse, bison, reindeer, saiga, a system ecologists later nicknamed the Mammoth Steppe. Archaeology reads your route in bright stations. Dalny Vestinus, Pavlov on the Moravian plain with hearths, nets, fired clay figurines, and winter tents. Kostenki on the Don with deep layers of initial Upper Paleolithic and later Gravettian tools. Sunger near Vladimir with burials draped in thousands of ivory beads. Far to the northeast, the Yana rhinoceros horn site above the Arctic Circle, where people worked bone and hunted big game 32,000 years ago, proving the high latitudes were not a rumor but a workplace. You walk where herds write the calendar. In spring, reindeer flow north like quicksilver with hooves. In autumn they return as if escorted by the wind itself. You learn a useful trick. Watch the does. They choose crossings with a prudence that saves ankles and tempers. Your band becomes a migration mirror. Not chasing, precisely, but shadowing. Time to calving meadows and river fords where meat becomes manageable. The steppe rewards patience more than sprinting. You move camp sideways as often as forward, learning the lee of low ridges where the wind styles your hair but spares your fire. Historians still argue whether mammoth bone dwellings on the Dnieper and Desna, think Meserik, Gonsi, and their cousins, were long-occupied winter houses or seasonal headquarters on a commuting circuit. Whether the piles of mammoth bones reflect organized hunts, scavenging and natural traps, or a mix depending on year and weather. They also debate how much active mammoth hunting your kid allowed. Projectile technology improves across these centuries, spear throwers, back blades, but a 30 tons of opinion elephant relative is not a rabbit. Your camp vote's pragmatic. You take what the season gives, from reindeer at fords to horse on snowy pans, and you do the math backward from how many shoulders a band can carry before meat becomes lecture instead of dinner. Quirky tidbit to tuck behind your ear flap. Saiga antelope, with noses like folded mittens, are walking barometers. When their snouts keep low and their trot turns decisive, you brace for dust or cold, because their built-in filter appreciates calm air. Another odd, useful thing, in this latitude, snow squeaks at about the temperature where your breath also starts to narrate. The squeak becomes a thermometer you can step on. You test it twice, feel smug, and then declare yourself acting meteorologist until someone throws a snowball, and you demote yourself with dignity. The light up here becomes a new colleague. Nights grow short in their season and long in theirs. Twilight sometimes refuses to stop considering. You switch from Polaris to shadows when the sun refuses to clock out, steering by the long smear your body writes across the plain. When night does arrive, it often arrives with curtains. Aurora like slow silk, subtle enough to keep this a bedtime show, but lively enough that everyone stares and forgets the stew. Joke 2. You appoint the Aurora director of unscheduled meetings. It waves green and declines to minute its own session. Mainstream truth, second glow. At Sunger, 2 people, often called Sunger 1 and Sunger 2, were buried with beads sewn onto garments, ivory spears, fox teeth, and mammoth ivory bracelets around 37,000 years ago. The labor in those beads, thousands each worn smooth, says not only style but time, a surplus of evenings turned into ornament and identity. Such burials whisper a social world where ties, kin, ritual, obligation, travel with you across the grass like a second map. Your day-to-day kit becomes winter competent without turning surly. You keep fat as currency, it burns, it cooks, it polishes cold out of air. Lamps of bone or stone sip tallow and throw quiet moons on hide walls. Sinew shrinks obediently when damp and warm, making lashings that tighten themselves if you bribe them with a breath. You learn the beveled ice trick. Cut an air hole at an angle and the wind refuses to answer. Cut it straight, and the hole becomes a call you wish you hadn't made. The steppe loves settings. You become good at settings. Historians still argue whether the earliest spear throwers, atlatls, took hold first in Western Europe and spread east, or whether parallel solutions bloomed across the steppe where range and penetration matter against big, wary prey, whether microblade systems in the east, tiny backed bits set into slots, represent mobile winter logic converging on the same insight as composite points farther west. The argument is civilized because the outcome is weeknight, efficient repairs, interchangeable parts, less sulking when a tip chips. Rivers still choreograph everything. You favor oxbow meadows that read like grocery lists, willow catkins, cordage and medicine, back eddies, fish that regret boasting, sedge roots that peel like kindly onions. Ice becomes infrastructure in season. A frozen ford turns distance into errand. Your group learns to hear ice grammar, the singing cracks that say settling, the sharp reports that say edge. You carry a probe, really just a stick with opinions, and it saves more ankles than soup. Quirky tidbit number 2. Where permafrost lingers, your neighbors dig coal pits, cellars lined with bone and turf, where the air sits at tolerant temperatures long past spring tantrums. The pits learn to smell like good choices. And because travel likes reputation, you mark a safe ford with a wicker wand and hang a fox skull facing downstream. A tiny billboard that says cross here, not where the river tells jokes. One morning you find the skull turned by a prankster wind. You fix it and appoint the wand acting signpost with back pay and beads. Mainstream truth, third fire. Far to the east near Lake Baikal, at Malta and Buret, houses dug partly into the ground with bone frameworks and hearths show winter strategy around 24,000 years ago. While human remains carry genetic threads later noticed in parts of Native American ancestry, one of many quiet strands in the braid that will, in a few sections, reach Beringia. Even farther north at Yana, above the Arctic Circle, people made jewelry from fox canines and decor from mammoth ivory, a reminder that style refuses to hibernate. Historians still argue whether people on this steppe followed strict annual circuits keyed to reindeer schedules or ran flexible loops. Reindeer in one chapter, horse in another, salmon in a third. They argue population sizes and how many neighbors you could bump into on a week's walk, whether long-distance partnerships traded stone, shells, and mates along lines as wide as the Don, Volga, Euro corridor. Your camp's answer is folk math. You know at least 3 other bands by their fire smell, song dialect, and the way their sinew edges always look just a little proud. Night has its audit up here as everywhere, water, snow melted without sarcasm, coal, banked in a small earth saucer to keep frost from mood swings, edge, tips seated, sinew smug, tar behaving, sky, Polaris patient, or are either working late or on vacation. Joke 3. You salute a ptarmigan that has chosen to believe you cannot see it because it is white and confident. You appoint it undersecretary for bold assumptions, and it waddles away with tenure. You end the day with soup logic. On a flat stone warmed at the rim of the fire, a greased lid keeps broth from making speeches in the wind. Marrow turns to kindness in the pot. Someone carves a reindeer shoulder blade into a snow shovel, and the shovel applauds by working. Someone else strings grouse feathers into a line that answers the wind politely instead of arguing. The steppe, for all its theater of big sky, becomes domestic under your hands. As sleep nudges you down, you picture how this broad lawn of grass is not emptiness but a highway ridden by hooves, a place where certainty, of herd paths, of lee ridges, of frozen fords, is more valuable than scenery you'll barely watch because your hat is down over your eyes against the glare. You don't conquer it, you join it. Tomorrow the herds will underline a new sentence across the plain, and you will read it with your ankles, the way experts read music, out loud, in step, and with enough breath left for a joke at the end of the line. You keep walking until the map runs out of trees and then out of excuses. Ahead lies a continent that hasn't signed its name yet. Behind, a continent that already knows your song. In between is Beringia, not just a bridge but a whole country of wind, fat with grasses and low willows, dry enough that your breath crackles a little, wide enough that the horizon feels like a thought you haven't finished. Some days it's a land corridor, some days, when ice fattens and seas retreat, it's a broad plain where fox trails read like calligraphy and mammoths argue gently with the weather. You test the snow with your stick and learn a new grammar, sastrugi that point the way the storm remembers, dwarf birch that hide their leaves like good secrets. Rivers that run shallow and quick because they're in a hurry to be other rivers. Beringia teaches patience disguised as housekeeping. You standardize lamp rituals because nights yawn long. You stack grease lids like tiny moons over your stews because wind can't argue with lids. You preen your sinew seams until they hum when plucked, a sign they'll forgive tomorrow's cold. Joke 1. You open the door flap for the 100th time and appoint the north wind deputy of surprise visits. It thanks you by arriving on cue. Mainstream fact to warm in your middens. During glacial lows, Siberia and Alaska were connected by an exposed landmass that archaeologists and geologists call Beringia, wide enough at times to be a region more than a bridge. People lived here, not just passed. Sites like the Yana rhinoceros horn locality north of the Arctic Circle show folks working bone and hunting big game roughly 31 to 32,000 years ago, and later Alaskan sites, Swan Point, Dry Creek, Broken Mammoth, carry hearths and tools by around 14 to 13,000 years ago. To your feet, this evidence reads simply: the plain was a home, then a hallway ***, then a memory, depending on where the sea kept its furniture. You learn there are two highways forward, and each speaks in a different voice. Inland, an ice-free corridor sometimes opens between the Great Laurentide and Cordilleran ice sheets, a cold hallway with its own rules, steppe tundra in places, rivers learning to behave, caribou drawing dotted lines that your ankles can read. Along the Pacific, another possibility winks. A kelp-braided coast where seaweeds make underwater forests, shellfish stud the rocks, and small boats turn rough shore into pantry and path. You try both in your head while you stir the pot. The choice is not a duel, it's a calendar. One route speaks earliest in food and wind, the other waits until the ice agrees to become permission. Historians still argue whether the first Americans came chiefly by that Pacific kelp highway, before the inland corridor became reliably passable, or whether small bands used both, braided across centuries, coasts first when ice sulked inland, corridor later as rivers and grass published their welcome notices. They also debate the tempo, how early coastal voyagers could have reached far south by the time sites like Monte Verde in Chile, about 14,500 years ago, light their hearths, and whether Paisley Caves coprolites in Oregon and hearths at Cooper's Ferry in Idaho, with dates proposed around the 16,000s, point to pre-corridor entries. You don't referee at bedtime. You practice both gait patterns, shore shuffle and inland stride, and keep your lamp modest. The coastal lane feels familiar if you've walked Arabia's and India's edges, read the swell, tuck into lee coves, glean mussels and limpets, listen to terns drawing lines toward bait fish. But this coast is steeper, colder, and busier with rocks that think they're sculptures. You keep skin floats and line baskets at the ready. You stash embers under rack the way you once did under seaweed. Mainstream facts quieter partner. Along the modern British Columbia and Alaska coasts, bits of evidence peek from high ground. Ancient footprints on Calvert Island, late Pleistocene rooms like on your knees cave on Prince of Wales Island. But much of the best campsite shelf is drowned now by rising seas, a tidy explanation for why the trail looks like a sentence with missing words. The inland option courts you with predictability. A corridor is a machine for repeating days, rivers to follow, oxbows with polite fish, muskeg that you learn to avoid by reading spruce ankles. Caribou run like commas across snow. You learn to put your weirs where the river forgets to be clever. The first weeks taste like cold tea. The third tastes like competence. Quirky tidbit. When your breath turns your eyelashes to a fringe of frost, you smear a dot of grease at the lash line. Half vanity, half physics. The frost sulks and goes elsewhere. You appoint the grease undersecretary for visibility. It accepts the portfolio without boasting. Historians still argue whether the interior corridor was biologically friendly early enough to sustain long migrations. Did it offer wood, game, and berries by 15,000 years ago? Or did it function mainly later as a back route northward and eastward once people had already threaded the Pacific side? They parse pollen cores, lake muds, and ice retreat to write the calendar. You write your own by fish runs and caribou calving, which is the version you can carry without charts. You meet rumors of standstill and store them as a bedtime story. Genetics will one day propose that some ancestors lingered in Beringia for a long winter of history, thousands of years, becoming a distinct population before fanning into the Americas. The idea tastes right to a traveler. There are places that are not just thresholds, but homes in waiting, teaching kids to be winter honest and jokes to be windproof. You do not need the math to feel the truth. The lamps burn longer here. The songs accumulate verses about fox tricks and ice grammar. Beads learn to be patient on sinew. Mainstream fact, third lamp. In Alaska's interior at Upward Sun River, 2 infants were buried 500 years ago with red ochre and delicate grave goods, a quiet window onto an ancient Beringian group distinct from later peoples. Far back west, you remember Ushki on Kamchatka and Dyakov's sites, stepping stones of rooms where bands sat out storms and tied new points onto old shafts. None of these are headlines at the fire. They're reassurances that your path has been someone's bedtime walk before. You keep your audit every night, because habit is the way across big rooms. Water. Some nights snow by choice, some nights skim ice over river, both acceptable, both requiring more polite patience than drama. Coal. Banked under ash inside a bone saucer so the ground can't steal heat by caprice. Edge points reseated, back blades snug in their grooves, tar warmed with a miser's hand. Sky. On clear nights Polaris does its old steady trick. On cloudy ones you steer by river breath and the sable hush of a spruce bog that never lies about direction. Joke 2 sneaks in when a lemming stops to scold your boot for existing. You appointed director of small opinions, and it darts into a drift to file a report you will never read. Later, a raven follows camp for half a day, offering commentary on your packing technique. You promoted to chief auditor of forgotten things and chastened, find the scraper you left on a tussock. You sample both highways because calendars don't argue, they alternate. In fair shoulder seasons, the coast offers kelp pantries and lanes between islands where fog rehearses its opera but never quite blocks bird logic. When ice and wind conspire, inland rivers put on good behavior, and you draft in the wake of caribou that know which saddles forgive hooves. You meet other bands who wear familiar bead orders but tie them with different knots. Trade a drilling trick for a fish drying recipe. Compare shell sounds on your wind chimes. The plain rewards neighbors more than heroes. Historians still argue whether the earliest footprints south of the ice, like those young tracks pressed into the white sands of New Mexico and dated by some to over 20,000 years ago, rewrite all timelines or whether lake chemistry and dating debates will redraw those lines more conservatively. They argue about bluefish caves in the Yukon, cut marks that some read as much older human signatures, others as natural scrapes. Your camp nods, adds a stick to the fire, and lets the wind referee in its own time. Until then, you keep walking, because the road is the only timeline your knees respect. Joke 3. The aurora shows up late and flamboyant, green scarves thrown across the black like it just remembered a party. You appointed Minister of Morale. It declines officialdom and insists on being weather. Everyone approves. Sleep takes you as the two highways braid themselves into your dreams. Rocky coves with kelp and mussels, cold corridors with fox prints and blue shadows, both ending in the same gentle arithmetic. Water, coal, edge, sky, checked and satisfied. Tomorrow the sea might be a friend and the corridor a teacher. The day after, they'll trade jobs without complaint. Either way, the map ahead is not empty. It is polite if you are, and it loves a traveler who knows how to bank a coal and read a current. The fire has a way of turning your thoughts into family trees. You sit with your knees up, palms warm, and feel how the flame's little forks remind you of lines that split, and keep walking. You've followed rivers and stars. Now you follow kin. Not by faces you remember but by quiet fingerprints tucked into cells, the sort of marks only very patient people can read. You breathe, and under that breath your mitochondria carry a story that begins in Africa, rides out of it, and then blends with neighbors you've met in these chapters, old cousins under European oaks and deeper cousins in Asian hills. You don't need a lab to feel the shape of it. The fire draws the diagram for free. Here is the bedtime version, simple enough to rock you, sturdy enough to stand. Inside the African chapter, a lineage of mothers tagged by scholars as L carries much of our species forward. One branch, call it L3, steps toward the door you've been walking through. Outside Africa, that branch fans into two big lanterns named M and N. Their daughters fill most roads you've been traveling. M and N and all their busy grandchildren scattered from the Indian Ocean lanes to Sahul and the cold steppe. Mainstream fact to set beside your cup. Nearly all living people beyond Africa trace their mitochondrial lines through M or N, which descend from L3. The exact date of that branching is still a polite argument, but its pattern is steady enough that even a sleepy traveler can remember it. You roll a bead between finger and thumb, the one you've been using to count tides and long days, and it helps to imagine each bead as a mother. Its string as time. Some strings knot and return, some splice into other strings, some break and later hands tie them back together. The sky above you is full of stars that share light. Your ghostly aunties and uncles do something similar with bits of code, a family reunion that took place in caves and clearings instead of hotels. The route out of Africa was not a sterile hallway. You already guessed that from the way caves share leases and valleys share habits. Mainstream truth, whispered kindly, most people living outside Africa carry a small Neanderthal fraction, roughly 1 or 2% on average, threaded through their genomes. The amount varies. The pieces differ by neighborhood. The meaning is less scandal and more footnote. Bands met, shared evenings, and sometimes made family. Farther east, some of your fellow travelers carry a Denisovan thread, especially high in parts of Melanesia and present in smaller measures across Asia. A reminder that another archaic cousin lived, loved, and left goodbye gifts in our code. Historians still argue whether those meetings happened once in a dramatic moment, or several times in polite installments. Near Eastern first contact? Central Asian revisits? A meeting on a winter steppe when lamps were behaving? And geneticists joined the quarrel with graphs that look like spaghetti done by accountants. They also argue whether the M and N lanterns represent one dispersal polished by time or multiple departures that braided later. Whether some back journeys into Africa carried foreign threads home again. You let them argue with warm tea. Your job is to feel the texture of blended kin without needing to referee exact calendars. Quirky tidbit for your pocket. Sometimes the past is caught mid-chew. A wad of birch pitch found in a northern bog, chewed and spat out thousands of years ago, kept enough of a person's saliva signature that modern readers lifted a whole genome from it, plus crumbs of that day's lunch. Elsewhere, sediment DNA from cave floors has coughed up Neanderthals and Denisovans even when bones decided to be shy. The moral, if bedtime stories need one, is that houses remember who sat by their fires, and sometimes the floor keeps better minutes than the guests. The practical part of admixture is almost cozy. If someone hands you a gene that copes well with new altitude or novel germs, your grandkids keep better hours. Mainstream fact, polished with a sleeve, Highlanders of Tibet carry a version of EPS1, a blood oxygen regulator, that seems to owe thanks to Denisovan-like donors. It helps bodies behave kindly where air is thin. Other borrowed bits sit in the immune bookshelf, variants that greet unfamiliar microbes with appropriate enthusiasm rather than panicked speeches. This isn't superheroes. It's housekeeping done by committee, the genome learning to pack a smarter pantry for new weathers. Historians still argue whether the Denisovan story is one cousin or several look-alike lineages scattered across Asia, some greeted briefly, some invited to stay for tea. They argue how many admixture pulses visited Southeast Asia as travelers moved through Wallacea and into Sahul. Whether one Denisovan bouquet explains New Guinea's high percentages or whether multiple bouquets got passed along at different islands. You think about the hand stencils in Sulawesi and Borneo and imagine cousin hands pressed to other caves you haven't seen, their pigments washed away but their codes still saying hello every time a Tibetan chest meets a mountain morning without complaint. You catch yourself smiling into the fire at an old rumor that admixture is somehow untidy, that stories should stay pure to be understood. You know better from cooking. Stew is stew because broth remembers bones and roots share their patience. The step you crossed works because willow, sedge, and snow negotiate. Your string bag holds many filaments, none of which can carry a deer alone. Jeans are not cathedral windows. They are repair kits with stickers from all the towns you pass through. Mainstream truth, second bead, back in Africa, lineages diversified richly. Many L branches stayed home and kept history, while back migrations later brought Eurasian flavors into North and East Africa. Inside Africa, there are signals of archaic ghost admixture too, threads from unknown neighbors whom bones haven't introduced yet. Your bedside gloss. The homeland never stopped being busy. The door swung both ways. And the idea of a single clean arrow never belonged to living landscapes. Historians still argue whether the basal Eurasian component, that hypothetical branch which seems to carry less Neanderthal and more deep divergence, reflects a population tucked somewhere in North Africa or the Near East, later joining West Eurasian mixes, or whether we are seeing an accounting illusion that tomorrow's data will erase. Every field needs a friendly mystery to tuck under its pillow. They also debate the tempo of skin, hair, and metabolism changes. How much was local adaptation versus borrowed from neighbors? Your fire produces the only useful conclusion for tonight. People adapt when they sit still long enough to learn names for winds. You keep your 3 jokes quota because the genome appreciates humor. Joke 1. You dub your sinew ancient collagen technology and declare that everyone is 2% Neanderthal in the morning before coffee, which is untrue, but your ankles agree with the sentiment. Joke 2. You decide your string bag is Denisovan because it refuses to get tired uphill. The bag demands authorship credit on the next spear repair. Joke 3. You draw a little equal sign in ash on the hearthstone, the old mark of balance you've been carrying, and promote it to Minister of Mixed Company. The mark sits there and looks correct. A second quirky tidbit. Someone in your band strings tiny shells and fox teeth not just for shine but as a ledger. 1 bead for each camp visited. 1 tooth for each good crossing. Generations later, beads get rethreaded and moved. A genome does something similar. Segments get chopped and reshuffled every time a child appears. After a few thousand years, the puzzle still adds up to the picture, just with new edges. That's why modern readers need math and patience to see what your camp could feel in a week. We are made of each other. You let the audits run. Water-topped, coal-banked, edges smug, sky politely doing its rotation, and then tuck this whole admixture chapter under your blanket, where it keeps the same temperature as your ribs. The comfort is simple. Your journey doesn't just move bodies across maps. It moves solutions across families. A piece that was useful in a cave near the Black Sea may turn up grateful on a Tibetan pass. A tweak borrowed under spruce might help a child under paperbark. The network hums. Historians still argue whether the earliest meetings with Neanderthals happened in the Levant as you passed through, or later as bands looped back along Eurasian corridors. whether coastal first people carry different admixture mosaics than river first neighbors. You don't mind. Arguments mean the story is alive. The ember turns over, stares at you like a small fox, and decides to keep you company until morning. You tip your head back. The sky wears its old certainty lightly. Somewhere above, the North Star job will pass to another actor in epochs to come. Somewhere inside you, the roles of M and N will keep playing down the generations. Somewhere in your elbows is a tiny thank you note from an uncle who hunted in snow long before you. You exhale. The fire forgets a crackle and remembers it. Balance holds. The family tree makes no sound and all the sounds at once. You close your eyes on that soft arithmetic. Mixed is normal, shared is strong, borrowed is wise, and sleep as if someone who loves you just tucked the blanket under your shoulder. By now you can walk with your eyes closed and still keep north in your pocket. Even when the route itself dissolves, shorelines drowned, dunes rearranged, rivers migrating like ideas, the world leaves traces that behave like breadcrumbs for sleepy minds. You follow footprints, tool signatures, loan words, and sky stories the way you'd follow a kettle's hum to the table. North becomes less a direction than a chorus you can hum from memory, even when the singers have changed and the stage has been redecorated by weather. You begin with the most literal lullaby, footprints. Sand holds a grudge and a blessing. Clay remembers with tidy handwriting. Salt pans act like archivists who love a clean font. You picture a child stepping in a puddled flat, then a taller companion stepping into those same ovals as if practicing agreement. Mainstream fact is set by the coals. In the modern basin of White Sands, New Mexico, delicate human trackways pressed into ancient lakebed mud have been dated by some studies to more than 20,000 years ago. Lines of small and large feet cross the ghost of a shoreline, sometimes overlain by ice-age megafauna tracks and then recrossed by people again. The scene looks like a collaboration: morning walk, afternoon mammoth, evening walk. Pages reused by neighbors with different handwriting. The dates are a polite argument, and that's allowed at bedtime. You tuck the picture away, even when the map is loud with ice or quiet with heat. Feet try to keep rhythm. You tilt your head and hear other traces hum, stone habits that traveled like favorite recipes. A flake struck with a Levallois preparation has a profile you could recognize in the dark. A blade core tells you someone had a plan, not a tantrum. A microblade snapped into a slot whispers repair economy learned from long distances. The path is littered with bead dialects too, Nacerius shells far from NEC, fox teeth polished by cords and patience, ivory chips drilled into brightness. Quirky tidbit: when you run your finger along a millennia-old bead hole, you sometimes feel striations left by the original drill. Stone gossiping about twist direction. Clockwise here, counterclockwise there. You find yourself smiling as if the bead just told a regional joke. Language leaves its own kind of footprints, less tidy, but delicious. Loanwords walk without passports, names for shells and canoes, for resin and sinew, for star clusters that everyone keeps noticing. Modern families of speech, Afroasiatic spread across North Africa and the Levant, Indo-European braided through later farmer paths, Austronesian zigzagging across the Pacific like a confident child, arrive long after your earliest nights. But they are reminders that routes teach mouths to travel. You hum a vowel and it taps another vowel on the shoulder 3 countries away. Historians still argue whether Language trees can be pushed reliably into the deep Pleistocene or whether the clock smudges too easily. They also spar over whether certain sound pairs, names for the Pleiades, say, hint at ancient shared stories or coincidence wearing good cologne. You, being sleepy and practical, accept the modest version. Speech remembers direction in fragments. Enough fragments make a path you can walk while the stew finishes. The sky is the oldest co-author, and you let it take a bow. You've steered by Polaris when convenient and by relationships when it retired behind horizons. You've mirrored bird highways and swell angles. You've read Aurora like polite notes pinned to night. These habits fossilize as stories. A dipper that pours directions. A road of milk across the dark. A cross that pins seasons to the ceiling. The Magellanic companions that follow well-behaved travelers in the south. Later people bind these into constellations with formal names. Earlier people carry them as verses. Either way, a child can be told, "When that rises, we go." And the instruction lives longer than any map. You notice how materials keep score across long lanes. Obsidian carries a birthplace in its trace elements. A sliver found in a cave far from its volcano is a postcard that says, "We traded." The river ran both ways. Someone told a joke at the handoff. Beach stones turned into polishers travel with net mending. A Damar resin torch leaves a scent that persuades every later cave to remember one word: forest. Mainstream truth. Second note, in the Near East and Anatolia, much later than your earliest chapters, obsidian from Cappadocia shows up in distant sites as if rivers and feet invented courier services. The principle is older than the dates. Routes knit households until stone itself testifies. When scholars get excited about genes, you let them. It's their turn to hum. They trace M and N, those mitochondrial lanterns born of L3, across the world like fireflies. They diagram admixture with Neanderthals and Denisovans the way you diagram knots for a novice. Historians still argue whether some lineages signal single exits or multiple departures with reunions, whether a Beringian pause was a long winter or a footnote, whether basal Eurasians lodged near North Africa or the Levant while others ran ahead. Your contribution is to keep the kettle modest and the metaphors gentler than the graphs. Braids, not arrows. Choirs, not soloists. You collect rituals because rituals are portable maps. Every night you run your 4-point audit: water, coal, edge, sky, and discover it's the same checklist a family would have used beside a Nile backwater, beneath a Carmel cliff, in green Arabia, along the Makran Shelf, under Sulawesi karst, at a top-end billabong, on the Don, in Beringia. The words rearrange, the logic refuses to. Joke 1, you stamp your foot on a dune, declare it Department of Reassuring Floor, and promote the nearest smooth stone to chair of meetings that could have been fires. Sometimes the echoes are sound rather than object. Route songs, lists of headlands, springs, fords, safe trees, lee coves, aged more gracefully than cairns. A child taught to sing tides grows up with distances hidden in their lungs. Quirky tidbit: when you hum at a certain pitch inside a limestone cave, thin stalactites answer with faint, glassy notes. The cave becomes an instrument that allows your song to measure itself. You can't pack a stalactite, but the habit of listening returns every time you face wind and water that say, "Prove you can hear us." The myths we inherit are sometimes simply calendars and costumes. A trickster who steals fire is also a person who learned to bank a coal. A sea goddess offended by noise is a shoreline reminding toddlers that long fetch plus strong wind equals weight. A hero who follows a thread out of a labyrinth gives away the technology of navigation. Leave a line you can retrace. Historians still argue whether any given story can be pinned to a specific corridor. You decline to pin butterflies at bedtime. The comfort is enough. Stories ride with people, and where you find a good story, you've probably found a route. Mainstream fact, third cup. Some rock art repeats hand stencils, dot constellations, boats, nets, hoof lines. A visual index of household skills that correlates suspiciously well with your favorite lanes. On Sulawesi and Borneo, in the Kimberley, in Pleistocene Europe's limestone salons, hands say we in the negative space. The habit survives because it's cheap and obvious and true. We were here. We'll be here again. Here is good enough to leave a print. You give yourself 3 jokes because roads like laughter. Joke 2. You award your string bag the title Senior Curator of Portable Echoes. Since it keeps swallowing shells, teeth, pigments, and all your pompous metaphors without complaint. Joke 3. You declare your oldest spear straightener an emeritus professor of lines that want to wander and promise to let it rest. Tomorrow. A last quirk before the room dims. Even smoke remembers routes. Dry juniper in Arabia, paperbark in Sahul, willow on the Don, spruce on Beringia. Each leaves a signature that clings to hair and tools. Dogs read your itinerary off your sleeves. Later archaeologists will read resins and charcoals and deduce the pantry you carried. You do not need their lab to feel what your nose already knows. Tonight's fire is telling a regional autobiography as soft as steam. Your final audit is the same as every other, which is exactly the point. Water, in the skin, in the pot, in the river's promise. Coal, banked, modest, a small sun that remembers last night and plans tomorrow. Edge, tar not sulking, sinew humming, blades sitting like truths. Sky, the dipper tilted, the river of milk poured thin, the faithful north less a star than a habit. Historians still argue whether your favorite lane was the first or the best or the most important. You argue for kindness, to feet, to weather, to neighbors, to the memory of small rooms that kept families warm. You lie back, and the ceiling presents a closing image that is not a finish line. It is a braid running from African night fires to Arabian ponds, along Indian monsoon caves, across Wallach's karst to Sahul's billabongs, up Danube terraces, over the mammoth grass, through Beringia's wind, and into new rooms with old chores. The braid hums like low surf. It says, follow the repeatables, water, food, shelter, stories, and the stars will only ever need to confirm what you already know. You let that sentence lengthen until it becomes breath. North is wherever tomorrow's kettle hums. Sleep treats the whole route like a road you can walk in place. Let everything grow quieter now, the kettle's soft breath, the slow shift of the mat, the small sigh of ash settling over a well-behaved coal, until the room is mostly rhythm and almost no thought at all. You've walked enough for tonight. The long braid of routes can rest where it belongs, behind your eyes, looping through shorelines that whisper, rivers that keep their paragraphs neat, grasslands that widen into calm, and star maps that never insist, only suggest. You don't need to memorize it anymore. The path is stored in your ankles and in your breath, the way a lullaby is stored in a chest that knows when to rise and when to fall. The gentle audit one last time, slower than slow, water, present, cool, exactly where your hand expects it, coal, banked, promising a cooperative morning. Edge, content, no splinters, no complaints. Sky, there even when cloud plays curtain. With north not so much a point as a friendly habit you can put back in your pocket. Let those 4 small yes lengthen into something like sleep, and let the pictures drift. Mangrove knees and cave drip lines, green lakes in a place that should be dust, hand stencils like signatures of belonging, billabongs catching the moon, terraces stepping down to old, unhurried water, aurora folding green scarves over the horizon, Beringia's wind laying out a table and setting it with silence. You don't have to hold any of it. The night will hold it for you. If you wake, you'll listen for water, touch the warm ash, pat the tool that stayed sharp, tilt your face toward whatever piece of sky the room permits, and then roll back into the groove your body made, the safest compass there is. North can hum without you for a while. Rest the map. Rest the hands. Rest the eyes. The world will wait, patient as a shoreline at slack tide, for you to join it again at dawn.